Chapter 861. Uzbek is right. This is our mountain area. At night we will be hunting wolves. The Dionia will only become our prey. That's right. Let's do it. The leaders agreed and finally reached an agreement. 50 meters away from the Dionia army, nearly 7,000 Samoyed soldiers began to circle around the west and north sides of the army. They lined up in an extremely loose formation. Some of the soldiers even lay down in the grass. Alexis saw this situation and did not let the soldiers attack at all. He knew that once the soldiers started to charge, these seemingly lazy Samoyed soldiers would run as fast as rabbits and lure the soldiers into the mountains. That would be a disaster. Therefore, the two sides faced each other face to face, separated by a distance of tens of meters. Time passed little by little. The Samoyed soldiers were fearless, but the Dionia soldiers were getting more and more flustered. After all, this was a foreign land to them. Each of the team leaders asked Alexis if they wanted to retreat. This was met with a firm refusal from Alexis. Mathesius, the adjutant, could not help but say, "Commander, this is the first time we are cooperating with the Abenelum in battle. I don't really trust the Abenelum." Alexis interrupted him and said in a deep voice, "But I trust Borit more, and the most reassuring thing is that Xantiparis is there. Since he has agreed to this plan, he will definitely do his best to carry it out." Mathesius did not speak. He knew why Alexis said this. Because Alexis had fought side by side with Borit in the southern Italian war. More importantly, Alexis and Xantiparis were both mercenaries in the Persia expedition. They had a deep friendship and trust each other. However, as the sun in the sky gradually moved to the west, the surroundings were still calm. The expression on Alexis' face gradually became solemn. Finally, he could not help but say to Mathesius, "Go and call those Abenelum soldiers." The Dionysian army remained in place, which puzzled the Samnite leaders. "Aren't the people of Dionia worried that they won't have a place to sleep after nightfall?" Uzbek mumbled. "Perhaps the people of Dionia think that we will retreat before nightfall, so they are competing with us to see who is more patient." One of the leaders laughed. "I think they're waiting for reinforcements from Riverbend, but no matter how many Dionia reinforcements there are, it will be nighttime by the time they arrive." "They will become our prey," said another leader confidently. "Reinforcement?" Uzbek's heart skipped a beat, and he hurriedly asked the leaders of Hilpini, "Has there been any abnormalities in Abernalum these days?" "Abnormal? Didn't they send a group of soldiers to stand at the border to threaten us as soon as they see our people drive our cattle and sheep near their territory? But once our soldiers rush over, these cowards run away. If we weren't at war with Dionia, we would really want Leader Leskok to lead us over," said a leader from Benventum disdainfully. Another Hilpini leader understood what Uzbek meant and said, "Are you suspecting that Abernalum has surrendered to Dionia? Don't worry, no matter how much of a bastard Gurney is, he won't throw a javelin at his own people. Besides, he swore an oath in the name of Savone in front of the high priest. He won't go back on it. Besides, Leader Leskok has specially sent spies to keep an eye on the territory of Abernalum every day. If there's any abnormality, I'm afraid he would have already informed us." "That's right, Uzbek, don't worry. Even if the Hilpini tribe has conflicts, they won't kill each other." Several Hilpini leaders immediately responded, and another leader even said sympathetically, "To be honest, Leader Gurney is too harsh on Abernalum. It really hasn't been easy for Gurney these years." The leader of Beneventum looked a little unhappy, and Uzbek's expression became a little gloomy. He suspected that the Hilpini leaders were secretly mocking Segovani, the great leader of Kautini, for using a trick to kill Quinduk and conquer Narconia a few days ago. The atmosphere suddenly became a little quiet. The leaders of the other two tribes saw Uzbek's ugly expression and were about to say something to resolve the awkwardness. Suddenly, a scout hurriedly ran down from the west side of the mountain ridge. "Everyone! Leaders, bad news! South! An army has appeared in the south. There are many, many soldiers rushing over here. The leaders were shocked. Where did this army come from? Uzibek asked anxiously, because the south that the spy pointed to was not the direction of River Bend, but the west of River Bend, which was southwest of this mountain range. As far as he knew, there were no tribes or towns there. I don't know, because they are neither wearing red. The Samanese often wore red unlined clothes, nor black but black and yellow, the spy said with a little guilt. At that time, he only saw it from a distance on the mountains and hurried to report, and did not rush over to investigate carefully. Black and yellow? Could it be the people of Potentia? A Hilpini leader suddenly said. Everyone was shocked when they heard this. They all knew that there was a plant in Lucania City that could make yellow dye, so in the past, the Lucanian warriors mostly wore yellow clothes to fight. Could it be them? Since the war in southern Italy, the people of Potentia had not participated in any battles. The impression that the Samanese leaders had of them was still at the time when they plundered the territory of Potentia more than a decade ago, almost exterminating the tribe. As Lucania City had been incorporated into the kingdom of Dionia after the war began, not only the leaders of the various tribes, but even they subconsciously regarded Potentia as a part of Dionia, ignoring the fact that it actually existed independently as a free city. The situation was urgent. Uzibek did not have time to find out where this army came from. He only knew that it could not be the army of the Samanese tribal alliance. What should I do now? Retreat immediately? The anxious Uzibek looked at the panicking leaders, then at the surrounded Dionysian army in front of him, and realized that he had to make a decision quickly. But before he could make up his mind, a loud bugle sounded from the southwest, followed by a vigorous bugle call from the northwest. General, it is impossible to hide such a large army from our spies. Chief Gurney will definitely join forces with the people of Potentia to come here, the Abenelum guide, who was wearing Dionia clothing, was trying to explain to Alexis. Suddenly, he heard the bugle call from the west, followed by the sound of the bugle call. He was overjoyed. They're here. Our warriors are here. At this moment, Alexis, who heard the bugle call, did not listen to him at all. Instead, she immediately said to Matsius, "Quickly order the light-armored soldiers to attack. The other brigades will attack later." Matsius was stunned. "Commander, our reinforcements have not arrived yet. Should we wait a little longer?" "If we wait any longer, the enemy will escape," Alexis said without hesitation. When the bugle call sounded, the Samanese leaders already knew that they had been fooled by the people of Dionia. There was no doubt that they had to retreat, but such a large army had to retreat together. Otherwise, it would be easy for the retreat to turn into a rout. Which direction to retreat to was also a problem. There was the Dionysian army in the east, and a large number of enemies were coming from the northwest and southwest. As the mountains in the north were steep and difficult to climb, it seemed that only the south was relatively safe. But the south led to the Ophanto River. Who knew if the people of Dionia had set up an ambush there? The situation was urgent. The leaders quickly reached a consensus. While the enemy's reinforcements had not completely arrived, they immediately retreated to the west. When the leaders were about to quickly run back to their own troops, many gaps suddenly appeared in the Dionia's shield formation. 2,000 light-armored soldiers rushed out, holding leather shields and short swords, and attacked the Samanese soldiers. The confrontation between the two sides lasted for more than 3 hours, especially when the people of Dionia put on a stubborn attitude, gradually wearing down the fighting spirit of the Samanese soldiers. Many of the Samanese soldiers had already laid on the ground to bask in the sun. Only because they heard the bugle call from the west, they were called up by their companions. Before they could stretch their bodies, they saw the opposite side of the Dionia soldiers rushing towards them like hungry beasts. The distance of more than 50 meters was too short. Many of the Samanese soldiers who had been relaxed for a long time did not have time to retreat, and the Dionia soldiers rushed in front of them. It was only at this time that Alexis asked the bugler to blow the bugle call to attack. The attack of the light-armored soldiers of Dionia disrupted the already loose formation of the Samnese coalition. Some soldiers retreated, and some soldiers fought with the Dionia soldiers. The whole scene became a little chaotic. Originally, Uzbek wanted to wait for the leaders to reorganize their troops and retreat together. Now, he had no choice but to blow the bugle call to retreat. When the bugle call sounded, the remaining fighting spirit of the Samnese soldiers disappeared. Chapter 862. The Samnese warriors at the back were easily caught up and stabbed by the Dionia light-armored soldiers. Seeing that the Samni army was retreating, the Dionic light infantry, which was originally the second line of attack, also took the initiative to break away from the protection of the heavy infantry. They ran forward and quickly caught up with the light-armored soldiers. At the same time, they gradually expanded the net of pursuit in the east. Pollet, who was leading his troops to the foot of the mountain in the west, felt anxious when he heard the bugle call to attack from the east. He loudly ordered, "Don't get into formation, go up the mountain immediately and surround the Samnese." After giving the order, Pollet remembered Xanthoparis beside him and asked apologetically, "General Xanthoparis, what do you think?" Xanthoparis, who was already 60 years old, had followed the non-stop mountain march this time and was now so tired that his legs were weak. Supported by 2 guards, he panted at the side and forced a smile. "Sir Pollet, I completely agree with your decision. But we have to be faster. Don't lose to them." As he spoke, he pointed to the front. A few hundred meters ahead, there was a black and red troop also climbing up the mountain. Pollet immediately straightened his face. "You're right, we can't lose to the Samnese." He immediately ordered the bugler to continue blowing the bugle call to attack and had his men urge the soldiers to speed up the climb. The people of Potentia were also a mountain race and were not weak at climbing mountains. The soldiers took out the Dionia short swords they wore. They were bought from a weapons merchant in Dionia with the permission of the Ministry of Military Affairs after receiving military training from Dionia. Of course, they were not using them to kill the enemy, but to cut down the various branches and thorny bushes that blocked the way up the mountain. As the soldiers climbed the mountain quickly, Pollet, under Xanthoparis's reminder, had the troops behind him extend to the north, trying not to leave a large gap between them and the Abenelum army. Even though the 2 troops seemed to be in a race as they climbed with all their might, it still took them more than 20 minutes to climb halfway up the mountain. At this time, they could already hear the shouts and sounds of fighting coming from the other side of the mountain, and it was getting clearer and clearer. The soldiers immediately perked up. They knew that the enemy was not far from them. Borit also hurriedly got the orderly to inform the soldiers to find a flat area or stop advancing. They had to level the ground so that they could stand firm. The people of Potentia were not the only ones doing this. The people of Abenelum were doing the same. All the soldiers stopped advancing halfway up the mountain. From afar, it looked like a winding belt had been attached to the mountain range. More than 10 minutes later, the shouts became clearer, mixed with continuous exclamations and rustling sounds of branches rubbing against each other. Although the lush forest blocked their view, the Lucanian soldiers knew that the enemy had climbed over the ridge and was rushing toward them. Although these mountains looked relatively flat, the slope was actually not small. As the saying went, it's easier to go up than down. However, for these mountain races, going down the mountain was much easier than going up. Not long after, the soldiers of Potentia saw the enemy. Logically speaking, when fighting in the mountains, the side at the lower ground would be at a disadvantage. However, the Samni army was retreating, so these defeated soldiers who were running at the front actually slid down while lying down. Perhaps they slipped because they were pushing each other during the retreat, or perhaps they thought that they could run faster this way. However, when they saw the enemy in front of them, these Samni warriors, who were scratched by weeds and branches and whose buttocks were almost shattered, did not even have the strength to stand up. They could only scream in horror, "Enemy! Enemy! Enemy! In the end, they were either stabbed to death by the soldiers of Potentia, or they became prisoners of war. Then, a large number of defeated soldiers appeared. The Samurai soldiers who were running at the front adopted the method of running down. In order to restrain their inertia and prevent falling, they had to hug the trees from time to time. Therefore, they often could not protect the weapons in their hand. They either lost their shields or lost their spears. The last wave of defeated soldiers adopted the method of running down sideways. Although their speed was slower, it was steady. They also became the main force to attack the line of defense of Potentia. On the side of the Abenelum, when they saw their compatriots fleeing from the top of the mountain in panic, the mood of the soldiers was complicated. So was Gurney. However, he knew that since the start of the war between Samurai and Dionia, they had been defeated in every battle. Coupled with today's defeat, the defeat of the entire Samurai tribal alliance was inevitable. Only by following Dionia closely could the Abenelum be reborn after the end of this war. Therefore, Gurney only hesitated for a moment before giving the order to attack. The heavy javelins thrown by the soldiers pierced the Samurai soldiers, who were going down the mountain one by one. "Oh my God, it's the Abenelum! How dare you collude with outsiders and kill your own compatriots? Savone will punish you. Abenelum people, we all belong to the Hilpini tribe. Please let us go for the sake of the same tribe." Curses, curses, and pleas came from the defeated soldiers. The expressions of the Abenelum soldiers did not change, nor did they stop waving their weapons. The blockade, suppression, and discrimination of the Samurai tribal alliance against the Abenelum for more than a decade had borne fruit today. There was a deep hatred between the Abenelum people and the other Samurai people. This kind of estrangement could not be dissolved with just a few words. In the end, the routed Samurai soldiers fought with the Abenelum and Potentians who intercepted them. In order to escape, their bravery was stimulated, and they used the terrain to push back the enemy's line of defense. However, the Potentia Abenelum's line of defense was not breached. After all, Paulet had gathered 12,000 soldiers this time, and Gurney had also brought 3,000 soldiers. The total number of soldiers was 2.5 times that of the opponent. What's more, the defeated soldiers were disorganized, and disunited. After a series of fierce attacks failed to work, some of the defeated soldiers began to retreat. After all, although they used the advantage of climbing mountains to leave the Dionia pursuers behind, they were now intercepted by another group of enemies. Once the Dionia pursuers arrived, they would not be able to escape. Therefore, some of the defeated soldiers gave up on breaking through the front and turned to escape from the north and south in an attempt to bypass the enemy's blockade. It did not take long for the Samurai coalition's collective retreat to become a complete rout. The armies of Dionia, Potentia, and Abenelum launched a pursuit at the same time. In the end, the Samurai coalition suffered more than 1,500 casualties, more than 3,000 were captured, and more than 1,000 escaped. On the other hand, the Dionia coalition suffered less than 400 casualties. In the joyous atmosphere of victory, Xanthoparis, Paulet, and Gurney met Alexis, who was still in the valley. "Xanthoparis, you're not too late." Alexis tactfully expressed the dissatisfaction in his heart. After a long wait, not only did he have doubts about whether the reinforcements could arrive in time, but he even had a fear of whether he could successfully bring the troops back to the camp. Now that he thought about it, he was still a little scared. "On the way here, we encountered some problems, so we did come a little late, but it did not affect our final victory," Xanthoparis laughed. Gurney took the initiative and said apologetically, "The reason why we were late was mainly because of me." It turned out that after the Abenelum sided with Dionia, the Ministry of Military Affairs had originally approved Alexis's attack plan to remove the nail in Pucetti's and Downey's waist, Aquilonia. That way, Abenelum, Copsa, and Aquilonia would be united. This way, the entire southern region of Hilpini would belong to Dionia, which would reduce the defensive pressure on the kingdom's northern border. However, in the process of communicating with Gurney, Gurney revealed detailed information about the Samanai tribal alliance, which attracted the attention of the Ministry of Military Affairs. According to the information provided by Gurney and the number of the Samanai coalition in the previous 3 battles, including the previous battle with Kayutini, the staff calculated in detail and speculated that the current number of the Samanai coalition was probably more than 10,000 Samanai soldiers besieging Naples. Then, where would the thousands of Samanai soldiers be? Was the Samanai hiding some kind of conspiracy? The Minister of Military Affairs, Helos, had to seriously think about it. So, after communicating with Alexis, a new attack plan was formed. Alexis would still lead the troops from the east into the mountains and attack Aquilonia. If the Samanai really could not provide reinforcements, then they would directly attack Aquilonia. If the Samanai really hid thousands of soldiers and prepared to lure the Dionysian army to fight in the mountains, then Dionia had also prepared a backup plan. This backup plan was Arnlum and Potentia. Chapter 863. Taking advantage of the Niconia incident, Gurney declared that he wanted to prevent the invasion of the Samanese coalition army. He gathered the people in his territory and imposed a military curfew. However, on the appointed day, he only left 1,000 soldiers to guard the territory. He took 3,000 soldiers and quietly entered the territory of Dionia, but he did not enter Capsa. Because there were likely to be spies of the Samanese coalition army to the north of Capsa, the Abenelum army hid in the territory of Potentia to the south of Capsa. They met up with their troops and sent some people back to the Samanese mountains to investigate the enemy. Capsa was located in the upper reaches of the Ovtu River, south of Lake Kansa. The topography of the upper reaches of the Ovtu River was somewhat special. Other than the relatively flat terrain around Capsa and Lake Kansa, the north bank to the east was high and difficult to climb, while the south bank was relatively flat. This was why the Samanese coalition army had to meet up in the Capsa area during the Southern Italian War and invade Potentia from there. When Alexis led the army into the mountains and set up camp at the river bend, she sent a messenger to the west along the south bank of the Ovtu River and finally entered the territory of Potentia. Xanthoparis, who was in charge of coordinating and commanding the Abenelum and Potentia coalition army, was notified. Xanthoparis, Borit, and Gurney, who had been carefully observing the movements of the enemy, received a report from their spies early the next morning. There were 6,000 or 7,000 Samanese soldiers in the mountains to the north, marching southeast. They immediately led the 15,000 soldiers north into the upper reaches of the Ovtu River and rushed east along the south bank. Capsa was more than 30 miles away from the river bend. After more than 4 hours, the army reached the west side of the river bend. The north bank here was relatively flat. Just as Xanthoparis was about to order the army to cross the Ovtu River and enter the north bank, Gurney made a suggestion. Since he was very familiar with the terrain of Aquilonia, he thought that the Dionysian army would lure the Samanese coalition army into the valley. However, if they rushed to Aquilonia together from the south, it would be too noisy and cause the Samanese coalition army to escape from the northwest side of the valley, which was easier to climb. So he suggested that the Abenelum army go north first, quietly make a big circle to the northwest of Aquilonia, launch an attack, and encircle the Samanese coalition army together with the army of Potentia. In this regard, Borit expressed his objection, but he did not explain the reason. He only quietly winked at Xanthoparis. In fact, he did not trust the Abenelum to act alone, fearing that they would tip off the Samanese coalition army. However, after careful consideration, Xanthoparis agreed to Gurney's suggestion. After all, it would be easy for such a large army to defeat the Samanese coalition army. However, the Ministry of Military Affairs hoped that if the Samanese really had troops in the mountains, it would be best to make full use of the large number of Potentia, Abenelum coalition army, while they were unaware. They would try to encircle and annihilate the Samnese forces in the mountains as much as possible, which would be beneficial for the Dionysian army's next attack. Although Xanthoparis did not know Gurney well, Gurney's suggestion was most in line with the requirements of the Ministry of Military Affairs, so he decided to take the risk. Half an hour after the Abenelum army left, the Potentia army began to cross the river. Because of these reasons, the army arrived nearly an hour late. After listening to the explanation of the three, Alexis's expression became slightly better. After all, the final result of the battle did prove that their actions were right. So he intentionally looked at the sky and said, "It's going to be dusk soon. We should immediately lead the army back to the barracks in the south, and let the soldiers who have fought for a day have a good rest." The three of them agreed with his suggestion. After all, the main force of the Samnese in the mountains had been completely destroyed. However, small groups of enemies and even beasts could still attack them. It would be safer for a few troops to camp together. However, it was impossible for such a large army to squeeze into the existing barracks when they arrived at River Bend. They had to build a simple new camp next to it. Therefore, they had to make the best use of their time. At this time, Xanthoparis looked at the mountains in the east and asked, "What's the plan for tomorrow? Do we take Aquilonia first? It looks like this city is not easy to attack." The corner of Alexis's mouth twitched slightly. Although his voice was not loud, his tone was full of confidence. "In my opinion, with today's victory, even if we don't take Aquilonia, it won't have much impact on the overall situation. My opinion is that all troops directly march into Benventum tomorrow." After observing Aquilonia today, it had not made any movements, especially when the Samnese allied army arrived and surrounded the Dionysian army. Aquilonia's army did not come down from the mountains and took the opportunity to attack Dionia from both sides. Alexis judged that there were not many defenders in Aquilonia. "I agree with General Alexis's plan." Pollet, who had some understanding of the Samni people, loudly expressed his support. "We have to use this victory to expand our advantage and not give the Samni people a chance to breathe. As long as we take over Beneventum, the Hilpini people will be finished. Through Beneventum, we can also directly threaten the central town of the Cautini, Cautim." Xanthoparis, of course, also expressed his agreement. Only Gurney was deep in thought. "Chief Gurney, are you regretting that you should not have left the Samnese alliance?" Pollet saw this and said sarcastically. Gurney came back to his senses and hurriedly explained, "I'm thinking if I can persuade Aquilonia to surrender. Aquilonia has many tribesmen among the captured Hilpini warriors. Because it is close to Downey and Puchetti, it naturally contributed the most in the battle against Downey. Now they have witnessed the defeat of the Samnese allied army. I know the leader of Aquilonia. He is an old fellow who does not care about friendship and only values strength." Speaking of this, Gurney gritted his teeth. Before the Southern Italian War, the leader of Aquilonia was his father's most loyal supporter. After the Southern Italian War, he immediately sided with Lescoq and fully supported the issue of Abenelum. Under such circumstances, the possibility of Aquilonia choosing to surrender is very high, Gurney finally said. Being able to persuade Aquilonia to surrender would save a lot of trouble. Of course, Alexis would not object. She immediately made a promise. If Aquilonia is willing to surrender, Dionia can allow it to become a free city of the kingdom. This was not Alexis's idea. When the Ministry of Military Affairs briefly informed the 5 chairmen of the attack plan, everyone had seriously considered the problem of, under the coercion of force, if there are Samnese towns that request to surrender. Given that most of the towns in the Samnese mountains had poor environmental conditions and very limited output, directly annexing them to the kingdom would instead waste administrative resources. It was better to let them take care of themselves. For example, Aquilonia was located on such a high mountain. Transportation was very inconvenient, and they could only rely on herding for a living. Most of the elders and officials of Dionia would probably refuse to come here to serve as the chief executive and public office. I will now send someone up the mountain to persuade them to surrender. When we reach River Bend, we will know the result." Gurney finished speaking and prepared to make the arrangements. "Wait." Borit stopped him and said, "I suggest that it is best to bring him along. It will be better to convince the Aquilonians." He waved his hand, and his men carried over a corpse. Gurney took a closer look, and could not help but gasp. He knew this dead man. It was Uzbek, the chief of the Kodim tribe. He had a high reputation in the Kodim tribe, and was once a strong candidate for the position of chief of the Kodim tribe. However, he voluntarily gave up the competition with Segavani. I heard from the prisoners that he was the commander of this Samanese coalition army. When they broke out of the encirclement, he rushed to the front and was finally stabbed to death by my warriors. I think the emissary that I will send will bring him along. This will let the Aquilonians understand their current situation better." Paulet said loudly. Not only was he promoting his own achievements, but he was also secretly warning Gairn. Just as Gurney was silent, Alexis said, "I think this is a good idea." Gurney immediately wiped away the trace of sadness in his heart and said simply, "I will immediately let my men carry him up the mountain." In the evening, the soldiers of the Dionia coalition army were still resting at the river bend. The emissary that Gurney sent brought back more than 10 hostages offered by Aquilonia, including one of the sons of their chief. Aquilonia had surrendered. Alexis was overjoyed. She immediately comforted the people of Aquilonia and promised that after they went to Turii, Dionia would quickly release the previously captured Aquilonian warriors. Although the surrender of Aquilonia made the entire southern territory of Hilpini a safe area, Alexis did not let down her guard. She still ordered the sentries in the camp to strengthen the patrols. The night was uneventful. The next day, the 20,000 people of the Dionia coalition army broke camp and headed west. They went along the south bank of the Orfanto River and first arrived at Kopsa. Here, Alexis assigned 2,000 soldiers to escort the prisoners and the Aquilonian hostages back to Turii. She also discussed with the governor of Kopsa, Sima, about the supply of food and transportation. Xantiparis also left the coalition army at this time and continued to head west towards Anona. He once again led half of the reserve army stationed there, ready to show his skills in the upcoming battle. In the afternoon, the Dionia coalition army left Kopsa, went around Lake Kansa, and marched northwest. At dusk, they entered the territory of the Abenelum. At this time, outside of Naples, in the camp of the Samanese coalition army, the chiefs of the 4 major tribes sat in a large tent. All of them looked solemn because they had just received the news that the army stationed in the mountains had suffered a crushing defeat. Chapter 864. Leskok, this is what you call a damned plan to lure the enemy. 5,000 brave Samanese warriors are gone just like that. And my best friend Uzbek. Segavani cursed, but his eyes suddenly turned red. Uzbek was about the same age as him, and the 2 tribes' territories were adjacent. They had played together since childhood and established a deep friendship. So after the death of the previous chief of Kaltini, Uzbek gave up competing for the position of chief and fully supported him, allowing him to defeat Quinduk and become the new Kaltini chief. After he was captured, it was Uzbek who united with the other chiefs to resist the pressure of Quinduk to re-elect a chief, took the initiative to cooperate with the chiefs of the other tribes, and finally rescued him. Segavani was anxious, easily angered, and vengeful, making it difficult for people to get close to him. He had few friends, but he had a deep friendship with Uzbek for decades. At this moment, hearing the news of his death, he immediately lost control of his emotions. Leskok, don't blame Segavani for scolding you. You and Gurney have been enemies for more than 10 years, but you didn't raise your vigilance against him and didn't discover the signs of the Abenelum's rebellion in time. You really have to bear a lot of responsibility for this failure. The Pentennium chief Barthani also spoke out. At first, he had concerns about going to war with Dionia, but he was persuaded by Lesgok. As a result, the Allied forces had been defeated one after another, and the Pentennium had suffered heavy losses. His dissatisfaction with Lesgok was also increasing. Well, since it has already happened, what's the use of blaming each other now? That damned traitor once solemnly swore in front of the high priest, but he still betrayed the entire Samanese alliance. This is the first time in the history of our race. Who could have thought of it? Although the plan to lure the enemy was proposed by Lesgok, it was decided by us together. At that time, no one warned us to be careful of the Abenelum and the people of Potentia. We all ignored it. The Caracini chief Kontruk sighed. As the oldest of the four chiefs, although he had a fiery temper, he knew that it was more important to ensure the unity of the entire tribal alliance in times of crisis. Now that the Dionia allied forces have entered the mountains, and it is a large army, our homeland is under serious threat. Next, we must take immediate action to stop the enemy's further invasion and protect our territory and people. Kontruk reminded very solemnly. In this way we must stop the siege of Naples, which is a pity. Although the Caracini chief Bardani said so, there was not a trace of regret on his face. These days, the Samanese allied forces had ravaged most of the city-states of the Campaglia alliance, but they could not do anything to the high and thick city walls of Naples. They had attacked several times and lost some soldiers, but there was no hope of breaking through the defense of the city walls. The Samanese allied forces' ability to attack the city was lackluster. If it were not for the plan to lure the enemy earlier, the army would have long withdrawn. Now that the plan to lure the enemy had been destroyed, the other three had no objection to it. But where are we going to withdraw the army to face the enemy? A day ago, the people of Dionia were still near Aquilonia, and there is no update about them now. We are only 200 miles away from Aquilonia. By the time we lead the army to Aquilonia, who knows where the people of Dionia will have run to? Bardani raised an important question. Lesgok, what do you suggest? Kontruk asked. After all, the Dionia allied forces were operating in the territory of Hilpini, and Lesgok should be more familiar with the situation there. When he heard the news that the army left in the mountains had been defeated, Lesgok was first shocked, then ashamed, and then afraid. So, when Segavani and Bardani criticized him, he was still thinking hard about how to deal with this crisis. Although he was a little angry, he did not show it. As Kontruk said, he needed the entire tribal alliance to work together to drive away the Dionia allied forces that were wreaking havoc in Hilpini's territory. He glanced at Segavani, who was still grieving, and thought to himself, I did not notice anything unusual in Abenelum, but you occupied Narconia, which has a closer relationship with Abenelum, and planted many trusted followers in its territory, but you also did not notice anything unusual in the Abenelum army. Of course, he would not say these words. We should retreat the army to Beneventum. It's not that I'm being selfish, but because Abenelum, which is very close to Beneventum, has betrayed Samanet. This way, the allied forces organized by the Dionia can smoothly pass through Abenelum and attack Beneventum. Once they occupy Beneventum, Kel Udum will also be under great threat. At this point, Lesgok looked at Segavani. He firmly believed that even if the great leader of Caodim mourned the death of his best friend, he should understand how great the threat of losing Beneventum would be to Caodim. After all, the two towns were adjacent, only a dozen miles apart, and Caodim was located on a small plain in the mountains. The terrain was not dangerous, so he believed that Segavani would eventually support him. What if the Dionia does not attack Beneventum, but continues to attack north after conquering Aquilonia? Bardani immediately raised his concerns because he was worried that the heavy defense of Beneventum would leave the eastern mountain defenseless. If the Dionia army went all the way north, it would threaten the territories of Pentni and Caracini. Therefore, Constic also expressed his concern. Lescock shook his head and said, "The Dionia allied forces will not do that, because our army is not only stationed in Beneventum, but can also attack Abenalum. Occupying Abenalum will not only ensure the safety of Caudim's territory, but also continue to threaten Potentia through it. I'm afraid this is what the Dionia are worried about." Lescock is right. I agree to retreat to Beneventum. Segovani expressed his support loudly, completely without the grief and indignation he had when he scolded Lescock earlier. The leaders of the two most powerful tribes in the alliance had reached an agreement. Constic and Bardani actually did not have much choice. Besides, both of them also felt that Lescock made sense. Just as the four of them were discussing the retreat, Bardani could not help but say, "Actually, we can consider a truce with Dionia." The three of them were shocked when they heard this. Since the war with Dionia began, the Samni tribal alliance had suffered successive defeats and heavy losses. Many tribal leaders were quite resentful, and even their own confidence in the war was shaken. However, Lescock was the first to speak against it. "We tore up the covenant, declared war on Dionia, invaded the Downey region, and plundered the Campania alliance. These are serious violations of the Dionia's taboo. The tough king of Dionia will never negotiate with us. He can't wait to completely eliminate us who keep causing trouble for him, so we can only continue to fight until there is a turning point." Lescock understood that if the Samni alliance really surrendered to Dionia, he would be the first victim because Gurney, who had already turned to Dionia, would never spare him, so his attitude was very firm. "Turning point? What turning point?" Bardani asked with a slightly gloomy expression. "Defeat the Dionia in the next battle, or wait for Dionia to be defeated on other battlefields." Segovani took over the conversation. He also knew in his heart that if the Samni alliance really wanted to stop the war with Dionia, he would not have a good time because he was the one who started the war. He also lured and killed Quinduk, who was supported by Dionia, and killed and arrested so many Naconians who believed in Hades. But he would not say this out loud. Instead, he found a more adequate reason. "Bardani, don't be silly. Think about the last Tarantum that tore up the covenant and fought with Dionia. After the Southern Italian War, they surrendered to Dionia and became a free city. As a result, their territory was greatly divided, and they could not have their own army. The citizens of the entire city were kept in captivity like cattle and sheep. Do you want our Samni alliance to become the second Tarantum? Even if we want to negotiate, we have to create more trouble for Dionia and force them to take the initiative to negotiate. Only then can we obtain a more equal position in the negotiations and formulate a peace treaty that is more beneficial to us." "Negotiate? We are the descendants of Savone. We must not yield to any force. As long as the independence of the alliance cannot be guaranteed, we will fight to the end, even if it means death." Contruc was the oldest, but his fighting spirit was the strongest. He shouted to Bardani in the tone of an elder, "Show your courage. Your father's soul lingering in the shrine of Savone is still waiting for you to wash away his shame." Faced with the strong opposition of the three leaders, Bardani laughed and said, "You are right. The alliance can only fight with Dionia to the end. Only then will there be a way out." Late at night, a messenger from Beneventum arrived at the Samni camp, bringing the news that there was a large army in the territory of Abenalum. This increased the urgency of the four leaders to immediately withdraw the army to Beneventum. At the same time, a clipper from Ennona sailed into the port of Naples under the guidance of the light of the lighthouse. Not long after, the candles in the Naples Council Hall were lit. The high-ranking officials of Naples, the high-ranking officials of the Alliance who had come to seek refuge, and the reinforcements of the Alliance arrived one after another. Chapter 865. The Chief General of Naples, Onosius, waved a letter in his left hand and said excitedly, "Everyone, I've just received a letter from the chief executive of Enona, Adrianx. In the letter, he mentioned, yesterday, the commander of the Dionysian army, Alexis, led her army into the Samni Mountains from the east and joined forces with the armies of Potentia and Abenelum. Together, they annihilated the main force of the Samni that was left behind in the mountains and forced Aquilonia to surrender. Today, this 20,000 Dionia allied army has reached Abenelum and is preparing to attack Beneventum tomorrow. That's great. Our disaster is finally over. Berevan and the others are the central town of Hilpini. The Samni allied army outside the city will definitely retreat and defend our allies with all their might. Am I right? The Dionia have always kept their promises and will definitely come to Campania's rescue. You guys didn't believe it then, but what about now? Haha, General Aiolos, please forgive our ignorance. We have not fought alongside the Dionysian army like you and have a deeper understanding of them. How could we have imagined that the Dionia did not respond to our previous request for reinforcements just to suddenly stab the soft abdomen of the Samni? General Onosius, after the Samni retreated, I hope that Naples can immediately send troops to help us recapture Pompeii. No. They should help us first, Herculaneum. We are the closest to Naples. And us, Liternum. After receiving this good news, the gloom in the Naples Council was swept away. While everyone was happy that the disaster was over, they began to argue again because they were eager to rebuild their homeland. In the days after the Samni ambushed the Campania alliance, not only did they besiege Naples, they also sent troops to attack other city-states of the Campania alliance. Other than city-states with relatively special geographical locations like Sorrentum, Inaria, and Capii, many small coastal cities fell one after another, and most of the refugees escaped into Naples. Don't worry, everyone. Onosius comforted them and said, Adrianx mentioned in his letter that the commander of the Legion of Dionysia, General Xanthoparis, who was stationed at Enona, will be leading his army to Naples by ship tomorrow. He will join up with our army and recover the lost towns together. The crowd cheered again and praised. Dionia is indeed a good ally that keeps its promises, it's so thoughtful. With the presence of the Dionysian army, they were even more confident that they could recover their cities. Then, Onosius continued, the letter also mentioned that when the Samni army retreats, they hope that we can send troops to harass and obstruct them. Hearing this, the hall suddenly returned to silence. After a while, the councillors of Naples shook their heads and said, You want us to leave the city to attack the Simonians? No. This was too dangerous. Since the Simonians want to retreat, let them retreat. There's no need for us to risk the lives of our citizens. If the Legio III of Dionia had helped the Campania alliance defeat the Cautini a few months ago, it could be said that they had helped the Campanians regain some of their fighting spirit. However, this time, the large-scale attack of the Simonians not only shattered their fighting spirit but also deepened their fear of this terrifying mountain race. Of course, Onosius was also aware of this situation because he was also one of them. Instead, it was Aiolos who started to argue loudly with them. Onosius had no choice but to cough a few times to attract everyone's attention back to him. I would like to remind everyone that the Simonians are retreating. In order to vent their anger, it is very likely that they will burn down the cities that they have occupied and our farmlands. Should we stop them? In fact, this reminder came from Adrianx. After being the governor of Enona for more than 2 years, he had dealt with the Campanians many times. He was very clear about the Campanians' character. They could not be compared to the brave and tenacious Walshes and Helnikis. Therefore, in the letter, he did not mention that the attack on the Simonians' retreating army was to buy time for Alexis to attack Beneventum. Instead, he only emphasized this point. Everyone was stunned. Of course, the refugees from other cities would not allow their homes to be burned down, but the Neapolitans were more worried about the destruction of their farmlands. They had been supplying the military rations of the Dionia Legio III for a while now, and they also had to take care of the refugees from their allies. The food supply in the city of Naples was tight, and they could not place their hopes on Dionia, which had just experienced a drought, so they were all looking forward to this year's autumn harvest. Although the Caputini people rarely destroyed farmlands when they invaded in the past, that was because they were confident that the food produced by these farmlands would eventually become their next loot. However, under the current situation, it was hard to guarantee that they would not do something desperate and cause more trouble for the Campanian alliance. Therefore, after an emergency discussion, the Neapolitan councillors finally agreed to Adrianx's suggestion. Benventum, the largest town in the Simonians' tribal alliance. Although the Simonians were a mountainous race, it was rare for them to build a town on top of a mountain like Aquilonia. More than half of the tribes and tribal alliances lived in valleys and mountain valleys. Benventum was located on a relatively large and relatively flat hill surrounded by mountains. It was also the place where two rivers converged, so there was plenty of water and fertile land. Among the Simonians' towns, both grazing and planting were the most developed. Therefore, Benventum had always been at the forefront of the Simonians' tribal alliance, be it in terms of population or strength. Most of the time, the chief of the major tribe in its territory was the chief of the Hilpini tribe. There were only a few times when the other Hilpini tribes were jealous of Benventum's wealth and dissatisfied with the arrogance of the Benventum people. Only then would they work together to elect the chiefs of other regions as the chief of the tribe to compete with Benventum, and Abenalum was the first choice. The town of Hilpini was located about 40 miles south of Benventum. It was also a hilly area, but it was much smaller. There was also a river running through it, but the Saberto River, which was not considered big, eventually flowed into the territory of Benventum and merged into the Volturno River. Therefore, the people of Abenalum always felt that they were inferior to the people of Benventum. Even during the reign of the former chief of Hilpini, the outstanding chief of Abenalum, the people of Abenalum still felt a little lacking in confidence. After that, they had been enduring the bullying and humiliation of the people of Benventum for more than a decade. It was not until early this morning, when the Dionia coalition army left Abenalum and began to march towards the territory of Benventum, that the people of Abenalum cheered to send them off, thinking that the day of their revenge had finally come. The 3,500 Abenalum warriors walked at the front with their heads held high. In the middle were the 6,000 soldiers of Dionia, and behind them were the 12,000 soldiers of Potentia. Not counting the engineering battalion, medical battalion, mountain reconnaissance team, and the transport team at the back, the combat force reached 21,500 people. They lined up in a line of more than 10 miles long, marching north along the Saberto River. After leaving the territory of Abenalum, the shadows of the enemy began to appear in the forest on both sides of the river. Although there were not many of them, they had a commanding position. They threw javelins and arrows at the marching Dionia coalition army in the valley, and even pushed the rocks from the mountains into the river in order to obstruct the march of the entire army. Seeing this situation, after Alexis, Gurney, and Pollet discussed, they each sent 1,000 soldiers to leave the river bank and march into the forest on both sides of the river. At the same time, they would drive away the enemies that came to disturb them and protect the main army in the middle. In the process of marching in the valley, the main army also cleared the rocks and broken trees that blocked the road from time to time. When the sun had reached the middle of the sky, the winding river suddenly straightened, and the mountains that stood between the river not only became shorter, but also consciously retreated a mile away. The sight of the soldiers was no longer blocked by the towering trees. What came into view was the flat land on both sides of the river bank, green grass, and small trees. The Dionia coalition army had entered the territory of Benventum. The terrain here was somewhat special. 2 rows of rolling hills running north and south were like 2 parallel lines, guarding the Saberto River all the way forward. Between the hills was a flat grassland about 2 miles wide, and in the middle of the grassland flowed the Saberto River, which was no more than 20 meters wide and knee-deep. The vanguard of the coalition army stopped here, and the Abenelum warriors who had been trudging for half a day began to eat to replenish their strength, while waiting for the troops behind to come and join up. 5 or 6 miles ahead is the city of Benventum. Gurney pointed to the front and said to Alexis and Pollitt, who came one after another, "In the past, the land in front of us was the settlement of the tribes of Benventum, but now they have all withdrawn." Gurney introduced the situation of the territory of Benventum, but he could not help but sigh in his heart. In fact, most of his impression of Benventum was still at a dozen years ago. Since the war in southern Italy, his relationship with Lescauc became strained, and they finally became mortal enemies. The only time he came to Benventum was when the tribal alliance held a big ceremony here. If it was not for the support of the envoy of Dionia, he would have been punished by the Samnite priests. He came and left in fear, and he did not have the mood to pay attention to the changes in the territory of Benventum. What he was introducing now was from the intelligence collected by his subordinates over the years, and now he led the troops to completely wash away the humiliation of the past, and remove the shadow buried in his heart. Chapter 866. After listening, Borit turned to Alexis and asked, "Looks like the people of Beneventum are already prepared. Do we need to start setting up camp here? This place is too far from Beneventum. It's not enough to pressure them." Alexis observed the terrain in front with rapt attention. Then, he pointed to the long chain of hills that seemed to be about 100 meters high on the west side and asked, "How far is the mountain path connecting Cabutum and Beneventum from here?" "That's hard to say. There are quite a few mountains in between." Gurney thought for a moment and shook his head, unable to give a specific number. Alexis then pointed to the even lower hills on the east side and asked, "After going over them, the terrain on the east side should be flatter, right?" "Yes, General Alexis. You remember very well that from these hills to the east to the Volturno River, although there are some small hills, the terrain is relatively flat," Gurney replied. Alexis had his adjutant bring over a simple map of Samnite drawn according to the information provided by Gurney and the others. While consulting Gurney, he compared the terrain with the map in reality. After thinking for a while, he made up his mind and said, "We will march forward for another 3 miles and start building our camp. Chief Gurney, you will lead your warriors to set up camp in this valley and protect our food transportation route." Gurney heard this and heaved a sigh of relief. He immediately said, "Don't worry, we will guard this place firmly. Not even a single enemy will be able to slip through." For the Abenelumian warriors, the Sabato River was not only a food transportation route, but also the only way from Beneventum to their homeland. Now that the Abenelumian territory was empty, the troops that Gurney mentioned would definitely put 200% of their energy to guard this place. This was also Alexis's intention. He then pointed to the map and said, "Chief Borit, your army's camp extends from the south bank of the Volturno River to this side. Our Dionia camp is in between your two camps." Alexis's arrangement was based on the fact that the Abenelumian and Potentia had a feud more than 10 years ago. This was also the first time they fought together, so they lacked coordination. Xanthoparis had specifically reminded him before. Furthermore, the Abenelumian soldiers were few and the Potentia soldiers lacked battle experience. Dionia's camp was in the middle and could take care of both sides. At the same time, after the camp was built, it would occupy 2 rivers. Not only would it be convenient to drink water, it would also put a lot of pressure on Beneventum. I have no objections, but I hope the general can send someone to guide us in building the camp. Pollitt had participated in Dionia's military training before, so he knew that the Dionian army had a deep understanding of building camp. In order to ensure the safety of the soldiers' camp, he shamelessly made a request. Before Alexis could respond, Gurney immediately said, We also hope that the general can send someone to help build the camp. Although Gurney had not participated in Dionia's military training, he had visited the barracks of Turii many times. He had seen the training of the Dionia citizens, so he had some understanding of this. Moreover, he considered that the Abenolymian soldiers had the least number of soldiers. They had to build the camp and defend against the enemy's surprise attack. In fact, they needed the help of allies. Of course, this is not a problem. I will definitely do my best to help. Alexis was very happy that the two of them had such a request, because it would be convenient for him to unify the entire camp's plan and allocate manpower reasonably. After the three of them reached an agreement, Gurney led the army straight to the north, while Alexis and Gurney led their own troops, crossed the eastern hills, and headed northeast. Yesterday evening, after the Samnese coalition army received the news that the Dionysian army had entered the Abenolymian territory, Lescok couldn't wait for the other tribes to withdraw because he was worried about the safety of Beneventum. That night, he led more than 3,000 Hilpini soldiers back to Abella, regardless of fatigue. They set off in the early hours of the next day, marched quickly, and entered the city of Beneventum at noon. There were originally 1,000 soldiers stationed in Beneventum, originally to guard against the Abenolymians in the south. After Lescok led his troops back, the total number of soldiers in the city had increased to more than 4,000. They also heard that the other tribes' soldiers would be coming soon, so the confidence of the tribesmen was greatly boosted. However, Lescok was not satisfied with just defending and waiting. After learning the movements of the enemy through the spies he sent out, he immediately led the 1,000 soldiers originally stationed in the city. The other soldiers needed a good rest to recover their strength because of the continuous rapid march to the mountains in the east, and launched a surprise attack on the Abenolymians 3 miles south of Beneventum. As the commander of the Dionia coalition army, Alexis, of course, would not let down his guard in the unfamiliar mountains. Instead, he was even more cautious. He repeatedly requested that whether it was the Abenolymian or the Potentia army, they must send half of their troops to defend the camp that was being built. Therefore, Lescok's surprise attack was not successful. Instead, it quickly turned into a battle between the Abenolymian and Abenolymian soldiers. Both sides first threw javelins at each other, and then killed each other with spears. Although the number of soldiers led by Lescok was smaller, they were full of energy and had some advantages. However, with the arrival of 1,000 Dionia light infantry reinforcements from the east, Lescok could only retreat. However, he did not stop there. He sent the 2,000 soldiers who were resting in the city to attack the Potentia army from the east. While attracting the attention of the Dionysian army, he once again personally led the 2,000 soldiers directly to the Sabato Valley to attack the Abenolymians. However, the number of soldiers used by the Dionia coalition army for defense was more than twice the number of soldiers in Beneventum. After Alexis found that the Abenolymian side seemed to have become the main target of the enemy's attack, he simply stationed a light infantry battalion in front of the Abenolymian camp. Beneventum's attack did not cause much trouble to the Abenolymian army. Instead, it increased some casualties. For Beneventum, which was lacking in troops, the life of every soldier was very precious. Lescok could only lead the troops back, who knew that as soon as he returned to the city, he would receive an urgent report from his men. Thousands of enemies were approaching Beneventum from the east. This made Lescok nervous. He immediately gathered the soldiers in the city and led them to the city to defend. Alexis led a battalion of heavy infantry and 3,000 Portantian soldiers as they approached the walls of Beneventum. Looking at the stone wall that was more than 7 meters high 100 meters away, Alexis recalled some of the information provided by Gurney about the city. More than 10 years ago, Beneventum was just a wooden city, and the simple wooden fences on the outside were damaged. They were only used to prevent beasts, not enemies. Because there were few civil wars between the Samnite tribes, and foreign enemies had never threatened the mountains, They had never worried about the safety of their homeland. However, after the rise of the powerful kingdom of Dionia in the south, the situation changed. The Samanai coalition army was defeated and humiliatingly surrendered to it. Even the Dionia people interfered in the internal affairs of the Samanai, causing the confrontation between Beneventum and the Abenalumian. Because of this, the deeply disturbed leader Lescock repeatedly called for the reconstruction of a strong Beneventum city in order to defend against possible foreign invasions. The leaders of the various tribes in Beneventum, who were equally disturbed, finally agreed to his suggestion. The Hilpini people had no experience in building a stone city, so Lescock specially borrowed many Campanian slaves from Caudim who knew how to build a city. Not only did he complete the planning of the new city, but he also found good stone materials to build the city on the north bank of the Volturno River, which was very close to the new city. After 6 long years, with the joint efforts of the various tribes in Beneventum, the new city of Beneventum was finally built. Lescock quickly invited the Samanai priests to hold a sacrificial ceremony in Beneventum in the name of celebrating the new city, which led to the subsequent series of events. Of course, in Gurney's narration, he had nothing good to say about Lescock and the other tribes in Beneventum, and he even accused Lescock, who proposed the construction of the new city, of plotting against Dionia. At the same time, he also mentioned a detail. The city blueprint designed by the Campanian slaves had the concept of an acropolis, which interested the people of Beneventum very much. They simply included the end of the eastern hill parallel to the Sabato River into the city, and the area of this hill occupied half of the area of Beneventum. They also built an inner city on top of the hill. Since then, Beneventum had the Volturno River as a barrier to the north, the Sabato River flowing in front of the city in the west, and the hills as a barrier to the south. Only the eastern side was relatively flat. This was the reason why Alexis led his troops to attack from here. Alexis's gaze went past the 7-meter-high stone wall and looked at the hill that rose from the south to the north, cutting off his line of sight. It was at least 30 meters high, and there were no lush trees on it, only densely packed houses and another stone wall on top of the hill. This was one of the reasons why he did not rashly give the order to immediately attack the city after the arduous journey of 20,000 Allied army soldiers. "Commander, the ballistae have been set up. Fire!" After Alexis gave the order, a moment later, 10 whistling bullets bombarded the city wall, the loud noise causing the Hilpini warriors to cry out in alarm. The deterrence of Alexis's troops to Beneventum caused Lescock to lead the main force to confront them inside the city, reducing the harassment of the Dionia Allied army troops that were building a camp. Chapter 867. At dusk, the Dionia Allied army dug trenches, cleared away the weeds and trees in the camp area, and started to build a wall. The entire Allied army camp was shaped like an ellipse, with the Potentia army and Abenalum army camps further north, while the Dionysian army camp was towards the southwest. This was because the eastern hills were not completely continuous and had some low hills. Considering that they needed more support for the weaker Abenalum army, Alexis extended the camp to the eastern hills, behind the Abenalum camp. This was to prevent the hills from cutting off the Abenalum camp from the main force, making it the focus of the enemy's attack. At this time, the main force of the Samanese allied army was bloated, carrying a lot of captured slaves and property, and with the harassment of the Campanian army, they had barely reached Caudium. At night, Lescock carefully planned a night attack on the Dionia allied army camp, with the main target being the Potentia army. Although the cautious Alexis had warned Paulet in advance, the Beneventum army's night attack still caused some confusion among the inexperienced Potentia soldiers. Then, Alexis, who received the news, immediately sent reinforcements. Because Lescock did not have enough troops, he could not further expand the advantages he had obtained. Before the enemy's reinforcements arrived, he ordered the soldiers to burn some tents and quickly retreat. On the same day, Xanthoparis led half of the reserve army, set off from the port of Enona, took a fleet, bypassed the Sorrento Peninsula, and landed on the coast near Pompeii without any hindrance. Then, he successfully recovered the looted city of Pompeii. Then, he sent troops to easily recapture the city of Aplantis, which was not far from Pompeii and was also deserted. After lunch, Xanthoparis left 200 soldiers in each of the two cities, then led 3,600 soldiers, marched east, and entered the Naconian territory. Some of the residents and priests of the small town of Barbaria, which was burned down by Segovani, had close relations with the Naconians over the years, and many of them could speak Samanese. They began to shout slogans in Samanese, such as "Avenge Quinduk," "Drive the Caudium army out," "Return Naconia to us," which resonated with the original Naconian tribesmen. Especially when they saw the familiar priests of Hades and the residents of Barbaria in the army, they immediately had a good impression of this army. Therefore, Xanthoparis' army was welcomed and supported by many Naconians, and people kept joining the army along the way. After Segovani lured Quinduk to death and occupied the territory of Naconia, because he was busy cooperating with other tribes and attacking the Campania alliance, he only slaughtered some of the Naconians who believed in Hades and forced the tribes to submit. He made them send out almost all of their young men to attack the Campania alliance. At the same time, he left 500 warriors from Caudium to guard the city of Naconia. As for the forced relocation of several large tribes in Naconia to other areas, and then the relocation of a few tribes from Caudium to Naconia to occupy the vacant land, due to the lack of time, the various tribes in Naconia had not been implemented yet, but the tribes in Naconia had already felt the crisis of survival, especially the barbaric behavior of the Caudium warriors in the city. Every day, the people in Naconia were angered. While the warriors of Caudium stood at the top of the walls and were shocked by the enemy's huge army below, half of them were Naconian tribesmen. Xanthoparis had lined them up at the back of the formation, so the warriors on the walls could not see them clearly. The people inside the city rejoiced at the arrival of the reinforcements and began to take action. While the Caudium warriors were defending the city wall, they burned the temporary camp of the Caudium warriors in the city. Seeing the burning camp, the Caudium warriors panicked even more. How could they not know that the inside of Naconia was as dangerous as the outside of the city? Their homeland was Caudium, and they were not determined to defend this city that had nothing to do with them. So, when they saw that the situation was not good, they immediately left the city and tried to escape through the east gate where there were no enemies outside the city. Unexpectedly, javelins were shot from the houses on both sides of the street, killing and injuring the fleeing warriors. On the street in front of them, the people in the city blocked the road with wood, mud bricks, stones. This caused chaos in the escaping army. After the Caudium warriors left the city wall, the people in the city quickly opened the unguarded west gate. Xanthoparis led the soldiers in, and under the leadership of the people in the city, they began to chase the enemy. The Caudium warriors were defeated. Other than a few who escaped the city, most of the warriors were either killed or captured. Since the leaders of the tribes were under Segovani's control, the people of Naconia who were freed from Segovani's control quickly elected a few respectable elders from the tribes to negotiate with the Dionian army. Xanthoparis also took the initiative to withdraw his army from Naconia to show his sincerity. Soon, both sides reached a simple agreement. The Dionysian army would do their best to protect the safety of Naconia, but would not send troops into Naconia. The tribes in Naconia would allow Dionia to transport supplies to Abenalum and provide as much help as possible. Dionia would send the Hades priests to Naconia as soon as possible to preside over the sacred affairs and repair the temple of the Hades as soon as possible. Dionia would do its best to help the Naconian warriors who were threatened by Segovani return home. Naconia would also send people with the Dionysian army to persuade the Naconian warriors to escape. After the agreement was reached, Xanthoparis let out a long sigh of relief. There were two parts of the agreement that were very important to the allied forces of Dionia. One was the issue of food transportation. If the food was transported by sea to Poseidonia, then through the rugged mountain roads to Capsa, then to Abenalum, and finally to the allied forces' camp in Beneventum, it would take a lot of time and energy. On the other hand, if the food was transported by sea to Pompeii, then through Niconia's territory, then to Abenalum, there were thousands of meters of mountains between Niconia and Abenalum. There were only a few narrow mountain roads connecting the two places, but the distance was not too far. This also prevented the Samnite army from crossing the mountains and intercepting the food route. The entire journey would be shortened by half. Therefore, when they parted at Capsa, Alexis and Xanthoparis had already discussed their plan. Recovering Niconia was the top priority. The other was to sign a friendly agreement with the Naconians. With their help, the Naconian warriors in the Samnite army could escape from the Samnite army and weaken their strength. However, Xanthoparis did not expect that the Naconians would take the initiative to bring back the priests of Hades. Perhaps it was because Segovani's wanton persecution of the Hades believers in Niconia had stimulated the rebellious mentality of the Naconians. In this chaotic time, the arrival of the priests of Hades could help the Naconians in many aspects, such as healing, relief, and comfort. This was something that the local priests of Savone could not do. That night, the defeated army fled back to Caudium. Segovani was shocked when he learned about it. The retreat of the army and the possibility of Niconia being attacked by the enemy was within his expectations. However, they lost the southernmost land of the Caudium tribes so quickly. The role and hostility of the Naconians in this matter shocked him. On the one hand, he blocked the news to prevent the Naconian warriors from knowing. On the other hand, he sent an additional 500 warriors to Lola and Caesarea in the west, including the defeated soldiers, hoping that these two cities could become a barrier to the south of Caudium. To be honest, he was not worried about the Campanian army, but he was a little afraid of the Dionia people, even though their numbers were probably small. The next day, the Dionia coalition army continued to build the camp. With the lesson from last night, the coalition army worked harder. They cut down trees, built wooden fences, built sentry towers, and arranged the abatis. On the other hand, Lescoq gradually adapted to the enemy sending troops to suppress the city and the bombardment of the ballista. He sent warriors out of the city many times to harass them. The Dionia coalition army also gradually became experienced in this and took corresponding defensive measures. After paying a small number of casualties, they forced the enemy to retreat. In the afternoon, more than 10,000 Samnite coalition army soldiers finally entered the city of Beneventum. On the same day, Xanthoparis led 3,600 soldiers out of the Niconia territory and marched north. After 2 hours of marching, they approached the city of Lola. Here, they met up with the 8,000 soldiers of the Campanian alliance from the west. The total number of soldiers reached 11,600. There were only 1,500 Caudium warriors in Lola. Of course, they were very nervous, so they closed the 4 gates and mobilized the entire city. All the warriors went up to the top of the city and prepared for defense. Chapter 868. Under Xanthoparis's persuasion, the general of the Campanian alliance listened to him and did not rush to attack. Instead, he followed the Dionysian army and built a camp a mile southwest of Laura. The reason why Xanthoparis set up the camp here was because it was close to the mountains, making it convenient to cut down trees and use them to build camps and siege weapons. On the same day, Melisande, the commander of the 10th Legion, under the instruction of the Ministry of Military Affairs, led the remaining 4 heavy infantry battalions out of Asculum and marched north to Iki, where they met up with the 11th Legion, which only had 6 heavy infantry battalions left. Capus, the acting commander of the 11th Legion, was appointed as the temporary commander of this army by the Ministry of Military Affairs. He was actively preparing for the next military action. "It's so noisy outside. What happened?" Stolo's wife, Cornea, asked the slave girl who had just entered the house. Mistress, they are all saying, Tustrum has surrendered to Dionia. The Sabine slave girl lowered her head, not daring to let her mistress see the irrepressible joy on her face. As Stolo and his wife were confined to their home these days, the slave girl was the one who went out to the square to collect food and gather information. She had learned from others that the status of slaves in the kingdom of Dionia was much better than in Rome, and it was easier for them to gain freedom. Therefore, in her heart, of course, she hoped that Dionia would win this war and let Rome be completely under the rule of Dionia. Tustrum has surrendered? How is that possible? Cornea found it hard to believe. In her memory, ever since the city of Alba Longa was destroyed by Rome, Tustrum, which also had a long history, had tried many times to occupy the Latin sacred mountain because it was next to Lake Alba Longa. It often claimed to be the center of the Latin people. Therefore, she thought that this proud city-state would resist to the end for the glory of the Latin people. She did not expect that it would surrender without even fighting a battle. Stolo sighed softly. Ever since the Dionia conquered the city of Gabii, they killed all the warriors who resisted stubbornly and turned all the other captives into slaves. This cruel practice must have frightened the surrounding city-state. Rabicum, Pedum, Artina have surrendered one after another. Even the powerful Tiber in the northern region has surrendered to the Dionia. Now, tens of thousands of Dionia soldiers are approaching the city of Tustrum, and the hostages that Tustrum sent to Rome are now in the hands of the Dionia. These hostages once followed the Roman nobles to the Capitoline mountain and were later sent down the mountain along with thousands of the nobles' families. How could they not surrender? After listening, Cornea whispered in a trembling voice, "So many Latin city-states have surrendered. Next, will the Dionia attack Villette, Saturnicum, and Antium? Can the Rome army led by Camillus and Titus, can they repel them?" Stolo was silent. Through this period of understanding, he knew that the attacks of the Dionia were always carefully planned. They were cunning, but they were also like a storm, swift and fierce. It was the same when they conquered the city of Rome. It was the same when they conquered Venus and Casrella. It was the same when they conquered Fadini and Lomentum. It was even more so when they defeated the allied forces of Rome. It had only taken less than 10 days to conquer the city of Gabii to the surrender of Tustrum. However, it had only been 2 months since the Dionia army landed on the coast of Latin, and they had already conquered more than half of the Latin region. Such a terrifying conquering ability did not give the Rome army a chance to rest and recuperate. Their morale was low and their military strength was insufficient. Even with Camillus as the leader, could they really turn the tide? After observing the progress of the war for so long, and after many sleepless nights, Stolo felt hopeless. He also discovered that the key to the Dionysian army's rapid conquest of Latin was that they were completely different from the Celt. They had a strong ability to assimilate. Just listen to the cheers outside the house. The civilians of Rome had completely forgotten their origins and regarded themselves as members of the kingdom of Dionia. Sigh. Stolo's silence made Cornea understand. In fact, her observations over the past few days had also given her a vague answer. When her worries were confirmed, she no longer yelled and screamed. However, her hands could not help but rub the corner of her clothes tightly. Her brows were tightly knitted, and her expression kept changing. Suddenly, she grabbed her husband's hand and said anxiously and fearfully, "Stolo, why don't you join the Dionia too?" Stolo was shocked. Before he could answer, Cornea seemed to have been inspired. She grabbed his hand tightly and said anxiously, "Yes, join the kingdom of Dionia. Only then can your father escape the danger of being defeated and captured. Only then can we persuade my father to come down the mountain and surrender. Only then can we persuade my sister and brother-in-law to surrender. Although we can't live in the city of Rome in the future, at least they won't be killed or become slaves." Stolo listened to his wife's worried narration and pleading. He could not help but hold her trembling body tightly in his arms. This time, he was really moved today. The reason why the people in Rome were so excited was not only because the Dionysian army had won one victory after another, but also because they were more certain that the rule of Dionia in the Latin region was getting more and more stable. It was almost impossible for the nobles of Rome to restore their rule in Rome. Their newly obtained land and rights would never be taken away again. Moreover, they also knew that the army that had been fighting outside for more than 10 days was about to return to Rome. This included 6,000 Roman soldiers. Although it was a tough battle to attack Gabii city, there was only continuous marching and accepting surrender. The casualties of the soldiers were not high, but in this chaotic situation, the people of Rome hoped to see their loved ones alive and kicking in front of them. When it was almost noon, nearly 30,000 Dionia soldiers led by Printos arrived in Rome. The king of Devers personally led the officials of Rome out of the city to welcome them. He announced, "In order to commend the soldiers for their contributions to the kingdom, we will hold a grand banquet for them at noon. And after the banquet there will be a rugby league match." When the soldiers heard the news, the fatigue and running of the past few days suddenly disappeared without a trace. They burst into deafening cheers. Since the founding of Dionysia, this was the first time a banquet was held during a war. Divers' main consideration was that this was the first time such a large number of Dionysian soldiers were away from home, and they had been fighting on foreign soil for such a long time. Hence, they must be given a chance to relax. Now that the situation in the entire Latin region was gradually becoming clearer, and the order in Rome was becoming more stable, the Devers dared to make such a decision. Over the past month or so, the Dionysian army had captured cities one after another and forced the city-states to surrender. They had seized a large amount of food, livestock, and belongings. Of course, it was not a problem to prepare a banquet. But in fact, there was no need to consume a large amount of grain. The chef of the Devers served as the chef of the entire banquet. The dishes carefully prepared for each soldier were quite rich. A pot of steaming mutton soup, a piece of fragrant fried beef, a grilled river fish smoked with herbs, a handful of washed cabbage that could be dipped in sauce, a small cup of cooked chickpeas, a handful of olives and nuts, a piece of baked honey bread, and of course, a bottle of watered wine in order to prepare for this grand banquet. More than 500 fat sheep and nearly 100 cows were slaughtered in the city of Rome. For the past 2 days, the soldiers stationed in the city had caught thousands of pounds of fish from the Tiber River with fishing nets. The soldiers of each legion enjoyed the food in their barrack. The 6,000 reserve soldiers of Rome did not have their own barrack. After obtaining the consent of the Devers, Sextus led them to the Mars Square in the northeast of Rome for a meal. The City Hall of Rome borrowed the kitchens of nearly 100 civilian families on Mount Palatine and hired their chefs to prepare dishes under the guidance of the chef of the Devers. The logistical barracks of each legion sent their personnel one after another to Mount Palatine in order to collect the food. The scene was very spectacular, stretching from Mount Palatine to all directions of the city. The king of the Devers took Crotocatax to the barracks of each legion to participate in the celebration banquet under the escort of the guards. Every time he arrived at a barrack, he would walk among the soldiers with a glass of wine and talk to them cordially. At the same time, he would let Crotocatax replace him to toast the officers and soldiers who performed well to show encouragement. It was not until this moment that all the legionnaires truly knew that the quiet young man who often stood behind the king, the young man who led the fierce attack at the last moment of the siege of Fadini and Gabii, was not an officer of the palace guards, but the prince of the kingdom of Dionia. The soldiers were surprised, but they also had a favorable impression of this gentle young man. One after another, they toasted him. Crotocatax didn't refuse any of the toasts. By the time he finished visiting each barracks, he was already swaying and talking drunkenly. The Devers had to let the guards help him back to his room to rest. Finally, the group of Devers arrived at the Mars Square. Sextus led the officers to welcome the arrival of the king of the Devers. However, the Devers proposed to stay and dine with the civilian soldiers of Rome who had just joined the kingdom of Dionia. Not only the officers, but even Sextus, who was more familiar with the Devers, was surprised. Before he could find a reason to refuse, the Devers had walked straight to the soldiers and sat on the grass without hesitation. Chapter 869. Marcius brought him a serving of food, and he began to eat while chatting with the soldiers with the help of the interpreter. It was the first time that the civilians of Rome were eating with a king. Not only did this king hold great power, but he was also rumored to be a descendant of the Greek gods. Hence they were curious and nervous. However, seeing that the king was not putting on airs and chatting with them in a very gentle manner, they gradually let go of their inhibitions and dared to talk to the Devers about some of the problems they were facing now. The Devers patiently responded to them one by one. As a result, soldiers continued to pour in. Although it made the guards busier, the atmosphere became livelier and livelier. At the end of the banquet, the Devers asked, "The next rugby game is going to be played. What are your preparations?" The soldiers responded at once, expressing roughly the same idea. Although they also wanted to participate in the game, they did not understand the sport at all and were afraid of making a fool of themselves in the game. The Devers smiled and told them, "In the kingdom of Dionia, rugby is very popular with the citizens. The game is intense and exciting. It can show the players' strength, speed, wisdom, and overall tactical cooperation. I believe that you will soon fall in love with it after you get to know it." The Devers continued to surprise them. He said, "This sport was inspired by Hades in my dream and then taught to the soldiers of Dionia. So, you can rest assured that I will soon teach you how to play rugby, and I will personally take you to the game." The soldiers were very excited after hearing that and actively asked to participate. From time to time, bursts of laughter broke out in the Piazza de Mars. Considering that there were 10 teams participating in the afternoon rugby game, they were the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th Legions, the 1st and 2nd Cavalry Legions, the Lucania Reserve Legion, and the Rome Reserve Team. The games would be held in the Arena of Rome and the Piazza de Mars, and the vast Piazza de Mars had also been opened up for 3 games. In addition to the soldiers stationed at the top of the city wall to defend against foreign enemies, the soldiers sent to scout the enemies around Rome, and the soldiers patrolling the streets to maintain order, not only the soldiers of the legions, but also the merchants and attendants of Dionia who came to trade in Rome to watch the game. It also attracted some people from Rome and the surrounding towns such as Venus and Fidena. In the past, in addition to plays and sports competitions, the only entertainment that the people of Rome could watch was the gladiator games. This was a cruel entertainment that the people of Rome had learned from the Etruscans. The audience was stimulated by the killing of the slaves in the arena. Especially in the past decade, with the increase of wars and the increase of captives, thereof gladiator games in Rome. It was their first time watching a Dionia rugby game. The grand scale of the game and the intense physical confrontation first attracted their attention. It did not take long for them to discover the overall cooperation between the two teams in offense and defense. The battle of wits and courage in the fast-paced game was also very interesting. All of these made them feel the profoundness and interest of this sport. Every time the referee blew the whistle to make a penalty, the coaches on the sidelines would promptly change the formation, and every player who came off the field would clap their hands to the sidelines. All of these made them realize the rigor, formality, and elegance of this sport. Therefore, the complicated rules of the game did not give the people of Rome a headache. Instead, it made the people of Rome, who were used to making laws and abiding by them, ponder the mystery of the game more carefully. After a few games, they, like the soldiers and spectators of the other legions, cheered for every attack scored by the players on the field, and sighed for every mistake made by the players. The Devers really fulfilled their promise and personally led the Rome players to the game. The spectators on the sidelines suddenly exclaimed and cheered, but the players of the Second Legion, who were the opponents of the game, were a little unhappy, as the coach, the commander of the Second Legion, Matones, immediately came over to protest. However, the Devers said, "These Rome soldiers have never played rugby before, and it is their first time playing against you. If I don't play, then you will win easily, and it will be unfair to the other legions." Under the Devers' insistence, the players of the Second Legion had no choice but to accept it. Of course, the Devers would be the quarterback, because that was the only way he could lead the whole team. Although he was already 40 years old, he persisted in exercising every day, so he had good stamina. Besides, the players of the Second Legion became a little timid in front of the king, whom they usually respected. They did not engage in fierce confrontations with him, so the Devers could organize the offense more easily. The news that the king of the Devers was going to play soon spread to all the legions. This was a miracle that was rarely seen in more than a decade. The soldiers rushed to the field one after another. They surrounded the field 3 floors away from the field and 3 floors away from the field. Every time the Devers caught the ball or threw the ball, it would cause thunderous cheers from the sidelines, which also caused a lot of psychological pressure on the players of the Second Legion. Under his command, the Rome players gradually began to play well, and they even scored a touchdown. Coupled with the natural tenacity and tenacious defense of the Rome players, the score was never pulled apart. This made the players of the Second Legion a little anxious, and their movements became bigger. The confrontation also became more intense. Under such circumstances, the Devers began to be targeted. There was even one time when he was knocked to the ground by an opponent who was so anxious that he lost his mind. The audience outside the field exclaimed. Matones and the players were so scared that they quickly came over to comfort the Devers. The Devers got up, shook his head, and tried his best to smile. Then, he comforted the perpetrator who was at a loss and told him gently, "I'm fine. It's a rugby game and it should be played like this." The heartwarming scene once again made the audience at the sidelines applaud enthusiastically. After the game resumed, Matones suddenly had an idea. He shouted to the bench, "Adoris! Adoris!" Adoris, who was wearing a simple game uniform, immediately ran to Matones and said excitedly, "Legion Commander, it's my turn to play?" "Yes." Matones said affirmatively. "When you get on the field, you'll be the central defense. Defend against the opponent's quarterback." Defend my father?" Adoris was dumbfounded. "There's no other way. No one else dares to defend against His Majesty seriously. Only you can." Matones shrugged helplessly. He then looked at him and said in a deep voice, "Listen, kid. We can't lose to the Rome players who are new to the game. Otherwise, the Second Legion will become the joke of all the legions in Dionia. As a soldier of the Second Legion, do you want that?" "No." Adoris answered without hesitation. "Very good. Go on the field and defend well." Matones encouraged him loudly and pushed him onto the field. Next, the Rome reserve team attacked. After both teams landed in their positions, the Devers saw Adoris standing in front of his teammate. He was slightly stunned and said, "Adoris, it's your turn." "Father, I won't let you pass the ball so easily again," Adoris said nervously. The Devers raised his eyebrows and said, "Oh, then give it a try." Indeed, Adoris did not have as many scruples as his other teammate. Although he was a little reserved in the beginning, he gradually let go of his hands and feet. There was no longer a scene of the father and son chasing each other, causing the soldiers outside to laugh out loud. The people of Rome who did not know the reason also laughed after they asked about it. As a result, the battle on the field was intense, and the people outside the field were laughing non-stop. Of course, once the players of the Second Legion got serious and the Devers were restricted, the newbie Rome soldiers were no match for them. However, when the game ended, many of the players walked off the field reluctantly. Just this game alone had made them fall in love with this sport. When the King Devers came off the field, the crowd cheered for him to continue the game. The Devers smiled and waved to the crowd to thank them. Due to the time constraint, the second round immediately began after the first knockout round. There were thousands of soldiers in each legion, and all of them knew how to play rugby. They could be rotated at any time, so there was no need for them to rest. The final match was between the First Legion and the Second Legion. The two legions were among the best in the kingdom. Not only did they compete with each other in military affairs, but they also competed with each other in other aspects. Naturally, they gave their all in this game. Therefore, the game was quite intense. The audience at the side of the field was also very nervous, and they could not help but cheer for both sides. There was another interesting scene in the game. Matones once again used his trump card. He sent Adoris to specifically attack Patroclus, the quarterback of the First Legion. The scene of the brother-in-law against the brother-in-law was played again, and it added a little more interest to the tense game. The Devers in the field were also very happy. It happened that Adoris made a crucial tackle that caused Patroclus to drop the ball, and the Second Legion won the championship by a narrow margin. When the game ended, it was almost dusk, but the lively atmosphere in the city had yet to dissipate. The soldiers of the various legions were still fiercely discussing their mistakes and regrets in the game. The soldiers of Rome and the people were still savoring the joy and excitement that the rugby game brought to them. Of course, the King Devers was also one of the topics that they were talking about. They did not expect the King of Dionia, who was usually high and mighty, to be so approachable. He was able to mingle with the ordinary people and was closer to them than the senators of Rome, who claimed to be the father of the people. This made them even more fond of the kingdom of Dionia. "Father, I'm sorry I'm late," said Crodocatax apologetically as he hurried into the living room. As he had just sobered up, his voice was still a little hoarse. Chapter 870. Sit down, everyone has been waiting for you for a while. The Devers sitting at the head of the table looked at him with concern and said in a gentle tone, "Now you know the disadvantages of drinking too much. You should control your drinking in the future. It's too uncomfortable to be drunk. I'll try not to drink in the future." It was Crodocatax's first time getting drunk. He rubbed his dizzy head and replied in a low voice, "You just need to drink less, but it's impossible not to drink. Otherwise, you won't be able to get along well with the soldiers." A voice came from the side. Clodocatax quickly turned his head and called out in a friendly tone, "Brother, thank you for the reminder." He then turned to the other side and nodded in greeting, "Hello, brother-in-law." Patroclus smiled and nodded. He also suggested in a friendly manner, "I also felt uncomfortable the first time I got drunk. At that time, my captain gave me some honey water to drink, and I felt much better very quickly." "Honey water? I'll try it later." Clodocatax expressed his gratitude and sat down next to Adoris. The Devers made a gesture to the servants standing at the side, and dinner was quickly placed on the table. The Devers smiled and slowly swept his gaze across Adoris, Clodocatax, and Patroclus. He said in a calm tone, "There's an old saying in the East, 'Father and son are soldiers in battle.' It means that when a father and son go to battle at the same time, they will often be very united and win the battle. For this expedition to Latin, all the adult men in our family are present. I'm ashamed that I've been here for almost 2 months. Because of the intense war, busy government affairs, and to avoid arousing suspicion, I haven't been able to give you more attention. Today is a rare opportunity, so I asked the 3 of you to come over tonight. We'll get together as a family, eat, drink, and talk. I'm very happy. The battles are so frequent and fierce, but none of you suffered any serious injuries. This is the greatest fortune. So, this first glass of wine, we want to thank Hades for blessing us." As he spoke, the Devers raised his glass. Adoris and Patroclus also raised their glasses. Only Clodocatax was a little hesitant. "Clotho, you've just woken up. Drink some honey water," said the Devers. His words made Clodocatax change his mind. He asked the servant to add more water to the wine and then poured a cup. After praying silently to Hades, the four of them emptied the cup. "Your Majesty!" Patroclus put down the goblet, filled it again, and said, "I should, of." Devers solemnly corrected her. "I said this is a family gathering. Why are you still calling me that? What should you call me, like Cynthia?" Patroclus hesitated for a moment before calling out respectfully, "Father." Devers responded with a smile. "That's wrong. Should I drink a glass as punishment?" Adoris looked at Patroclus with bright eyes. Patroclus emptied the glass in one gulp and then pointed the empty glass at Adoris. To be honest, although Patroclus was Adoris's brother-in-law, the two of them had never had a meal together. Patroclus's straightforwardness immediately suited Adoris's temperament, and he immediately returned a toast. "Haha, Patroclus, Cynthia is my eldest daughter. She helped us take care of the other children since she was young, so they all respect Cynthia. You married her, so Adoris and the others are a little resentful," Devers purposely said in a joking tone. Adoris touched his nose awkwardly. Clodocatax was slightly shocked in his heart, but it had already been more than 2 years. He had already accepted this fact, and had even forgotten the feelings in his heart. Patroclus smiled and filled the glass again. He said, "Father, what I wanted to say was, the helmet that Clotho gave me was very good. It even saved my life. When I was defending Ostia, I was fighting with the enemy. An arrow hit the side of my helmet. The helmet resisted the impact of the arrow and didn't make me dizzy. Instead, it gave the enemy an opportunity." Patroclus touched his head and recalled the dangerous situation at that time. He said with lingering fear, "So, I have to toast you, Clotho. Thank you very much. You saved my life." Patroclus stood up and sincerely raised his glass to Clodocatax. Clodocatax hurriedly stood up and said, "What father said just now was wrong. We didn't blame you for marrying my sister. Instead, we thanked my sister for bringing us such a good brother-in-law. Now that we are a family, helping each other is what we should do. On the contrary, according to the tradition of Dionia, I should first toast to you, brother-in-law." Devers was very satisfied that Clodocatax was able to overcome his previous emotional entanglement and behave so generously and appropriately. He looked at the 2 clinking glasses and happily patted the table. That's right, this is a family." Then, Devers picked up another glass of wine and said loudly, "This second glass of wine is to thank you for your outstanding performance in this war. Patroclus, as the captain of the First Legion, you were able to keep a cool head and command the troops well in these difficult battles, such as rescuing Wolsey, attacking Rome, defending Ostia. In these difficult battles, you were able to take the lead and boost the morale of the troop. I'm very proud of you." Adoris, in the battle of intercepting the Roman reinforcements and capturing Fedonia and Gabii City, not only did you perform very bravely, but you also led your team well. That's why you are promoted to the position of division leader. It's not because Matones wants to please you, because you are my son. You earned it with your own achievements. I'm proud of you. Clotho, you have just turned 18 years old, and this is your first time on the battlefield. Originally, I just wanted you to feel the atmosphere of the battlefield, and I didn't plan to let you fight the enemy alone, but you volunteered to fight many times. You participated in the battle of intercepting the reinforcements from Rome, defending Ostia, and attacking Fedini and Gabii. Especially during the attack on Gabii, at the most critical moment, you bravely led the palace guards to the top of the city wall, and made the first contribution to the attack on Gabii. You are already an excellent soldier, and I'm very proud of you. So, this glass of wine is to the 3 outstanding young men of my family. You have brought glory to the royal family with your outstanding performance. I thank you." Devers stood up and raised his glass to the 3 of them with a sincere expression. Then, he drank the wine in one gulp. Clodocatax, Adoris, and Patroclus listened to Devers's words, and all of them were in high spirits. After looking at each other and smiling, they raised their glasses and toasted back to Devers. Devers filled their glasses again, looked at them, and said earnestly, "This is the last glass of wine to our loved ones. We are fighting at the front, and they are worried at the back. Adoris, Clotho, your two mothers send a letter every day, and most of the contents are asking about your situation in Latin. What did you eat today? Did you participate in the battle? Did you get hurt in the battle?" In order to make them feel at ease, I have to spend a lot of energy writing nice words to comfort them every day. It's the same for you, Patroclus. Cynthia writes you letters every day, and I'm sure they are filled with concern for you. So, you have to remember that we are fighting for the peace of our home. Don't be overly engrossed in the battle, and forget your loved ones who are worried about you at the back. The expressions of the three of them, who had been in high spirits just a moment ago, instantly became grave. Patroclus thought of his wife who loved him deeply, and who was still pregnant. Clotocatax thought of Agnes's mother who doted on him, and Christoia's mother who seemed strict on the surface, but was actually very caring. Adoris thought of Christoia's mother, who had always been very caring towards him, and his sister, who had taken care of him since he was young. The three of them silently raised their glasses, and then drank it in one gulp, full of emotion. The living room was silent for a while, before Devers said, "All right, the 3 glasses of wine have been drunk. Next, let's eat and chat. Clotho, your stomach isn't feeling well, so I've specially made some oatmeal for you. Have some first." The servant had already brought the steaming hot rice porridge to Clotocatax's table. He scooped a spoonful and slowly drank it. The dinner prepared for them at night was beef and mutton hot pot, because Devers felt that it would be more lively for a family to eat this. However, Patroclus and Adoris had already eaten quite a lot at the banquet at noon, so their appetites weren't that great. After a few simple bites, Adoris couldn't help but ask, "Father, should we attack the Roman army hiding in the colony city southwest of Latin next?" "Yes." Devers confirmed his question and said clearly, "Rome is a vicious wolf. We should take advantage of its injuries to intensify our attacks, and not give it a chance to recover. This is to prevent it from biting us in the back. So, I've decided to personally lead the army tomorrow, and attack the colony city southwest of Rome, as well as the other Latin city-states that haven't surrendered yet." "Will our legion also participate?" Adoris asked hurriedly. "The 2nd Legion will go with me." After Devers finished, he looked at Patroclus. "The 1st Legion will temporarily stay in Rome, and together with the Lucania Reserve Legion, they will help the governor assists to maintain the order and stability in Rome. At the same time, you will need to send the injured soldiers back to Thurii, and the Thurii reserve soldiers will also need to rush to Rome to fill the gap of the 1st Legion. When the 1st Legion completes the reorganization, the 2nd Legion will rush back to Rome to exchange with you. In this way, I hope that while we destroy the Roman army, we can restore the full combat effectiveness of the legions as soon as possible. Because we have enough manpower, we also have enough military food reserves now." Chapter 871. "Father, is it because the situation in the south has changed?" Patroclus asked hurriedly. Devers was very satisfied with his sharp battle instincts. An outstanding senior officer should be like this. His eyes should not be focused on a single battle, but should be able to see the entire situation. He looked at the other two. Adoris and Clotocatax also looked at him with concern. They had been fighting in Latin and had little access to the outside world. Devers felt that it was necessary to let them know about the situation in other battlefield. Ever since Alexis defeated the Samnian army in Asculum and Venosa twice, the Samnian people no longer attacked the kingdom's territory. Instead, they launched a large-scale attack on the Campanian alliance, capturing Pompeii, Herculaneum, Tessara, and other cities. Finally, they besieged Naples. Isn't the Campania alliance in danger of being destroyed? Did we send troops to rescue them? Clotocatax asked in shock. Devers smiled and said, "Before attacking the Campania alliance, something else happened." Great leader Cautini lured Quinduk, the leader of Niconia, who had always been neutral, to death and occupied the territory of Niconia. His actions obviously provoked Gurney of Abenelum. Not only did he decide to make Abenelum a free city of Dionia, but he also helped us to attack the Samni tribal alliance. Therefore, the Ministry of Military Affairs made a new battle plan and let Alexis lead the army to attack the Samni mountains from the east. Father, I remember that you have repeatedly reminded the Ministry of Military Affairs not to let the army attack the Samni mountains. Clodo Catax exclaimed. He was a little worried that Helos and Felicius of the Ministry of Military Affairs would be reprimanded by his father for making the decision without authorization. Yes, I have given such an order before. Divers, on the other hand, looked calm. He said, but now the situation has changed. The Ministry of Military Affairs has secretly ordered Potentia to gather soldiers and quietly rendezvous with the army of Abenelum. They are familiar with the Samnese mountains and are good at mountain warfare. The Samnese wanted to lure us to attack the mountains, but we set up an ambush in Aquilonia and completely defeated their main force hidden in the mountains. Now, Alexis was leading a coalition army of nearly 20,000 to attack Beneventum. The Samnone coalition army that was besieging Naples had to retreat. In this way, we will be able to take the lead in the battle against the Samni people. Whether it is confronting the Samni coalition in Beneventum, or joining forces with the Campania alliance to attack the Samni towns on the eastern plains, or our remaining troops in the Downey area, taking advantage of the great opportunity that the enemy's main force is pinned down to continue to attack other towns in the Samni mountains. So, they don't need our help in the war with the Samni. Adorus's tone was a little disappointed. He then asked, Father, what about the situation in Sicily? Divers put on a serious expression and said slowly, ever since Plessis defeated the Carthaginian army in Minoa, not long after, our Sicilian fleet and the Carthaginian fleet had a huge battle on the sea near Serenus. In the end, a storm on the sea destroyed almost all the warships of both sides. Flario's drowned, and there's still no news of Sequirian. More than 10,000 sailors died. What? The three of them showed a shocked expression. They never thought that while they were fighting in the north, there would be such a terrible loss in the south. Devers continued, the Fourth Fleet has been transferred to Sicily, and we still have the advantage in the sea. Carthage led his troops to capture Serenus, and the remaining troops of the Carthage army were entrenched in a few important towns, not daring to attack. So Alexis sent his troops to plunder and destroy the areas ruled by the Carthage people in Sicily, in order to achieve the goal of taking the initiative to defend. However, the crushing defeat of the Carthage army caused Carthage's governor of Iberia, Margo, to become the new commander of the Carthage army. Now, the entire coast of Africa and Iberia are gathering soldiers and forming armies, preparing to land in Sicily. A new war is about to begin. We must get rid of the Rome and the Samni as soon as possible and rush to the south to fight our greatest enemy, the Carthage, to the death. Devers' words made the three young people feel the urgency of the situation, but at the same time, it also made them feel excited. On the day when Devers held a banquet in the city of Rome, held a competition, and rewarded the soldiers, the port of Utica welcomed a large fleet of Iberian troops. Utica, a city on the mainland of Africa, was second only to the Phoenician city of Carthage. It was located on the coast about 110 miles west of the city of Carthage. Margo's ship was the first to dock. Dressed in military uniform, he walked onto the dock. The elders, led by Pretacuba, immediately came forward to greet him. Lord Margo, welcome back. Margo gave Pretacuba a warm hug and said emotionally, You've worked hard, Pretacuba. It's all thanks to you that I've been away for the past few years. It's all thanks to you. Pretacuba patted his thick shoulder and said excitedly, It's good that you're back. Now that you're back, we have hope. Then Margo warmly greeted the other elders of the Magonid faction. Lord Margo, welcome. You've finally led the army here. An old man with white hair and beard greeted him. Dear Lord Esiaruba. Facing the leader of the neutral faction, Esiaruba, whose reputation in the Senate was second only to Hanno, Margot still bowed and said solemnly, Carthage is in danger. As the descendant of the city's founder, how can I sit back and do nothing? I'm glad that you can think this way and do this. This is what all the citizens of Carthage expect from you. Esiaruba said seriously. All? Margot sneered and pointed to the elders who came to greet him. That's not right. At least, some people who haven't been here don't think so. These elders who haven't come have gathered more than 60,000 soldiers for you, and are also gathering a huge amount of food to supply this army for you. They are also urging the shipyards and other allies to speed up the construction of warships, so don't be overly suspicious of your compatriot. They are also making their own efforts for the future of Carthage. Esiaruba said earnestly. This made Margot hesitate. He thought for a moment and his tone became gentler. Unlike the natives of Syracuse, Namibia, and Iberia, the Dionia are our real strong enemies. We need to do our best to defeat them. Therefore, I will do my best to maintain the unity of Carthage, and I hope that Lord Esiaruba can play a greater role in this regard. Don't worry, the previous fiasco has taught us a lesson. Whether it's Hanno, me, or the other elders, we all hope that you can win, because if you fail, it will mean disaster for Carthage. We will do our best to support you until the Dionia are driven out of Sicily and their king is forced to choose humiliating peace talks. Esiaruba promised. Margot expressed his gratitude, then turned to look at the port, waiting for his generals to gather the soldiers ashore and lead them out of Utica. Among the more than 20,000 soldiers led by Margot, there were not many Carthage and Phoenicians. Like the army led by Hasdrubal, most of them were mercenaries. Their different appearance and attire not only attracted the curious onlookers of the people of Utica, but also caused the elders who came to greet them to comment on them. At this time, a few more ships docked, and a group of strong men in striped trousers disembarked from the ships. They were all abnormally burly, muscular, and hairy. Their bodies were embroidered with strange tattoos, messy short hair, unkempt beards, and ferocious faces. As soon as they came ashore, the people at the port cried out in alarm. This seemed to agitate them. One by one, they used the long swords in their left hands to hit the long shields in their right hands, and they roared, looking even more ferocious. Most of the onlookers of Utica turned around and fled, and for a moment, the scene was a little chaotic. Fortunately, their leader stopped them in time. However, this did not guarantee that they would be able to line up at the port obediently. A group of terrifying barbarians. Are they also from Iberia? Esiaruba asked in surprise. The Celts of the northern mountains of Iberia. They do not fear death when they fight, and the other natives of Iberia fear them. It just so happened that there was a flash flood in their area, and their livestock and food were washed away. Facing a famine, I used thousands of cattle and sheep to exchange for their help. I believe that with them, our war against Dionia will be smoother. Margot said confidently. I hope so. However, this is also the reason why the Senate did not allow your troops to land at the port of Carthage. I hope you can manage your troops well and not cause any trouble here, which will leave a bad impression on the people, Esiaruba reminded him solemnly. Margot once again expressed his gratitude for Esiaruba's kind reminder. After all the soldiers came ashore, Margot's subordinates gathered them and took them away from the city of Utica. They began to set up camp outside the city, while Margot followed the senators to the city of Carthage. In the past decade or so, although Margot had lived in southern Iberia for a long time, he had returned to the city of Carthage many times. However, he never expected to encounter such a situation today. Almost all the people of the city ran out and crowded on both sides of the road. As soon as he entered the city, thunderous cheers sounded around him. The people shouted his name and threw petals at him. Chapter 872. Mago had never been treated like this before. He was shocked and looked at Pretacuba, who was next to him, with a puzzled expression. Pretacuba looked at him and said meaningfully, "Sir, this is not our intention, but the cheers of the people from the bottom of their hearts. Since the outbreak of the war, we have suffered a crushing defeat. The army of Dionia is ravaging our land in Sicily, and the warships of Dionia have attacked our merchant ships sailing to the west of Sicily from time to time. The people of the Sicilian colony have been displaced, and trade has declined sharply. They have now deeply realized that Carthage needs a hero to defeat the strong enemy and restore the prosperity of Carthage. I understand, I will let them see it." Mago looked dignified, raised his right hand, and waved to the audience around him. The cheers became even more enthusiastic. "Look, the king of Iberia is here, making himself look like a hero," Ocradon said sarcastically as he looked at the people surrounding him and walking to the Senate. "Hero? That will have to wait until he defeats Dionia," Teponlaco sneered. "He has brought more than 20,000 troops, and 60,000 troops have been prepared for him here. There are also 30,000 to 40,000 troops in Sicily, a total of 110,000 to 20,000 strong troop. This is the most powerful army in the history of Carthage. I am afraid that whoever is the commander of this army will easily win," another elder said disdainfully. The elders at the entrance of the Senate were discussing in whispers. Hanno, who was standing at the forefront, looked calm. Although he did not say a word, his heart was in turmoil. He had spent more than 10 years of effort to eliminate the influence of the Maganid family on Carthage. Even if the immediate family was driven out of Carthage, he had always been vigilant against Mago. Listening to the cheers of the whole city, it showed that the Maganid family still had a great influence in Carthage. The reason why the people of Carthage were so enthusiastic was because they were worried about the war in Sicily. If he had a capable general, how could the situation in the city become like this? Looking at Margot approaching him, Hanno was annoyed and jealous, but he kept a calm face because he did not want to leave a bad impression that he was the one who had stopped Margot from leading the army into battle. "Welcome, Brother Ma." Hanno's face was full of smiles as he praised loudly, "With you here, there is hope for our war against Dionia. That's why we've gathered enough soldiers and prepared enough rations for you, just so we can hear the news of your victory as soon as possible." Hearing his words of praise and looking at his seemingly sincere smile, Margot felt disgusted and could not help saying, "Carthage is in danger. If it weren't for someone's obstruction, I would have come earlier." Hanno acted as if he didn't hear it. His smile remained unchanged as he made an inviting gesture. Margot entered the Senate with his head held high. Oakleton moved closer to Hanno and wanted to say something. Hanno stopped him with a meaningful look. In the meeting hall, Margot gave a speech to the senators. He solemnly outlined the current dangerous situation Carthage was facing and thanked the senators for their trust in him. Finally, he made an impassioned promise that he would do his best to reverse the current unfavorable situation, defeat the Dionysian army, drive Dionia out of Sicily, and at the same time force Dionia not to invade Carthage's ally, Rome. He also forced Dionia to open its domestic trade to Carthage merchants to a greater extent, and forced it to reduce the size of the navy that posed a threat to Carthage. What Margot said was exactly what the senators wanted, so they responded with warm applause. At this time, Oakleton stood up while applauding and said coldly, "Very exciting speech. But a few months ago, Monte Ardino also said the same thing, but what happened?" A can of cold water was poured on the excited Margot. He was even more angry that the other party actually compared him to that incompetent person. He immediately refuted loudly, that idiot Monte Ardino was originally incapable of commanding this war. If it weren't for the insistence of some people, he would not have been able to serve as the commander at all. As a result, he treated war as a child's play and suffered a crushing defeat, causing Carthage to suffer huge losses. Shouldn't this responsibility be pursued to the end? Hanno raised his eyebrows. Oakleton laughed and said, Monteardino is an incompetent person? This is really funny. He has fought in Namibia for many years, never suffered a defeat, and won a large piece of land for Carthage. This achievement is no less than what you have done in Iberia. This is why the senators unanimously elected him as the commander. Even so, after suffering a defeat, he was severely punished. If there is a problem with this punishment imposed by the Senate, then I would like to ask Lord Hanno. More than a decade ago, Hilmico and you were defeated by Dionysius one after another, causing about half of the citizens of Carthage to lose their lives in Sicily. The losses suffered are much greater than Monteardino's defeat, but have you ever suffered the same punishment as Monteardino? Is this fair? You're talking nonsense. Margot was furious when the old scar was reopened, and he immediately scolded loudly. An imperceptible smile appeared on Hanno's face. Pretacuba immediately stood up and shouted, Lord Oakleton, now that the army has gathered and is about to fight with the people of Dionia, this will determine the fate of our Carthage. Yet you say these words at this time to disturb the morale of the army. What do you mean? Don't scare me, Pretacuba. I have no other intention. I just wanted to ask Lord Margot, but before I finished, I didn't expect him to react so violently. Oakleton shrugged, with an innocent look, and then said, What I wanted to say just now is that everyone can say good words, but it must be implemented in action. It is not easy for us to gather so many citizens to go out to fight, and it is even more difficult to collect enough military supplies for this huge army. Our treasury, our taxes, the gold and silver we excavate, all of them are invested in this war, and we can't support this war for a long time. So I want to ask, Lord Margot, can you give us a specific deadline to fulfill the promise you just said? Margot was stunned. Oakleton's words were approved by many senators. After all, Margot and Hanno had been arguing for more than a month, which could be said to have delayed the battle. Now that he had the army in his hands, if the delay continued, the senators would be at a loss. Even Isiaruba took the initiative to stand up and said, Lord Margot, Oakleton is right. The consumption of hundreds of thousands of soldiers is huge. We do need a more specific deadline so that the whole of Carthage can grit their teeth and do their best to provide the army supplies during this period. Pretacuba fiercely winked at Margot. Margot originally thought that if he could get the full support of Carthage and set a deadline, it would not be a bad thing. But when he saw the look in Pretacuba's eyes, he was a little hesitant. It seems that Lord Margot is not very confident in defeating the people of Dionia, Tepenlaco said sarcastically. Margot stared at Tepenlaco, then his sharp eyes swept to Hanno, who was also looking at him. He smiled disdainfully and said loudly, We all know that Dionia is a powerful country, and the war between us and Dionia will not end in a short time. I also know what you mean by saying this, but I am still willing to set a deadline, not only to urge myself, but also to give the people of Carthage hope. 1 year. Within a year, I will do my best to drive the forces of Dionia out of Sicily. The main force of the Samnese coalition entered Beneventum. The next day, they received news that Lola was besieged by the enemy. As soon as Segovani received the news, he immediately called for a military meeting and said anxiously, We will go to war immediately and repel the Dionia coalition in the south. Then we will lead the army back to Lola. Of course, Lescoq did not agree with this proposal. He patiently advised, Leader Segovani, the city of Lola is strong, and the garrison is not small. The enemy will not be able to take it in a short time. You don't have to be too anxious. You should know that the enemy outside Beneventum has a large number of people, and they have built a relatively complete camp. If we attack them head-on, our losses will inevitably be great, and we may not succeed. However, with such a large army of Dionia coming from afar, The supply of military food has become a big problem. As long as we send a few troops to sneak into the mountains, bypass their camp, attack the road between Abenelum and their camp, and cut off their food transportation, the people of Dionia will not have enough to eat and they will definitely panic. Then, it will be time for us to attack. Once we defeat the main force of the Dionia coalition, our situation will be much better. I agree with Leskok's opinion. We have fewer troops now, so we should be cautious. Batani said. After all, the Dionia's army could not threaten Bentney's territory. Of course, he did not want to take the risk. As for Kontruk, he was a little hesitant. Although Caracini's territory was far from the threat of Dionia's attack, as an old man who had always protected the interests of the Samanese race with a tough attitude, it was against his nature to adopt a prudent strategy. However, Caracini warriors had the least number of the four major races, and after several battles, they had suffered considerable losses. He had no choice but to pay attention to this problem, so in the end, he agreed with Leskok's suggestion. Chapter 873. Segavani was annoyed, but he had to follow the decision. Ever since Alexis learned that the main force of the Samanai army was stationed in Beneventum, she no longer sent troops to Beneventum. She also withdrew the ballista team, but the improvement and reinforcement of the entire camp continued. Although the intensity of the Samanai's attacks on the Allied army camp was increasing, the improved camp provided enough protection for the soldiers. The warriors of Potentia and Abenelum, who had not fought for more than 10 years, also gained a lot of experience from the successful defense, and their responses were getting better and better. Amidst the incessant sounds of battle, the camp of the Allied Dionians dug deep trenches, built thick earthen ramparts, sturdy wooden fences, towering sentry towers, and set up densely packed abatis and traps. The warriors sent by the Samanai allied army to attack the grain route were idle because Alexis had stored enough food in the camp in advance. The next day, bad news came to the city of Beneventum. Equum was besieged by the Dionysian army. Equum, a town of Hilpini, was located in the east of Beneventum, on the edge of the eastern mountains of Samanai, not far from the Downey area. It was neither located on the top of a mountain like Aquilonia, which was easy to defend and difficult to attack, nor was it like Beneventum, which had a large population. Half of the small population had been recruited by the allied tribal forces, and the Dionysian army that surrounded it was said to have nearly 10,000 people. The four leaders knew that if there were no reinforcements, Equum would fall very soon. But when Leskok saw Segavani sneering at him, he remembered what he had said to him yesterday, so he did not mention the reinforcements at all. Instead, he thought about how to persuade the Equum warriors in the army and appease the other tribal people who were wavering. But Bardani said worriedly, "The kingdom of Dionia has a large population and so many allies. They can gather much more soldiers than we can. Now they are using this advantage to increase their attack on us. Even if we gather all the warriors we have, there are less than 20,000 people. Even if we defeat the enemy outside the city, it will not change the fact that we are in a disadvantageous situation. Although we don't know how the war between Dionia and Carthage is going, it is obvious that Carthage does not have the advantage. Otherwise, the Dionia would not have invested so many troops into us. Our original hope of relying on the Carthage people seems to be in vain now. What should we do?" Bardani wanted to say we might as well stop the war with Dionia and negotiate peace several times, but in the end, he did not want to be scolded by that stubborn old man again. Of course, the other three could hear the meaning of his words, but even Kontruk remained silent. The room was silent, and the four of them were thinking about their own things. At night, Segavani, who was anxious about the current situation, received another request for help from Lola. The Campanian alliance of Dionia was in a hurry to attack the city. They had built earthen mountains that were higher than the city walls and many siege weapons that had never been seen before. They were a great threat to the defense of the city walls. If they could not get reinforcements immediately, Lola was in danger of being breached. Segovani finally could not sit still. He immediately went to find Leescock and asked him to bring troops back to Lola immediately. Of course, Leescock did not want Segovani to leave with his troops, because Cottini was now the strongest of the four major tribes. If they left, the entire alliance's strength would probably be reduced by half. So, Leescock hurriedly advised, "The main forces of Dionia are here, and there will not be too many enemies attacking Lola. You only need to send 1,000 or 2,000 reinforcements, and you can completely defend Lola. The most important thing for us now is to defeat the enemy outside the city." Defeat? How? Segovani interrupted him coldly. "Using that cowardly method of yours. Our warriors have been guarding the mountain ridge for 2 days, and have not seen a single pack beast transporting the supplies. Even if we really intercept the Dionia supplies one day, I'm afraid that Cottini's towns on the Campanian plains will be lost." At this moment, Leescock did not care about Segovani's mockery and directly advised, "If you are really in a hurry to return, why don't we discuss this and launch a fierce attack on Dionia's camp in 2 days? Defeat them first, and then return to help Lola together." "Enough. Leescock, do you think I'm a fool like Contrac and Bardani, who can be fooled by you as you please?" Segovani glared at him and scolded loudly. "We have sent warriors to attack the enemy's camp many times over the past 2 days, and many have died. I believe you know how difficult it is to attack the enemy's camp. Now you want us to attack it by force. Do you want all my people to die? Leescock, you are a person who only knows how to play petty tricks and only knows how to talk glibly. You are hesitant and lack decisiveness and ruthlessness. More than 10 years have passed, and you have not been able to kill Gurney and pacify the Abenelum. Instead, you have made them a great threat to us. We have launched a war against Dionia, and most of the operations we carried out were based on your suggestions. Until now, we have lost more than half of our warriors, and we have yet to achieve a single victory. 2 days ago, the Dionia camp was not as troublesome as it is now. If we had followed my suggestion and launched a fierce attack, we would have had a greater harvest, but you dissuaded us. Now, when the Dionia have completely repaired the camp, you want us to attack. Leescock, I have seen through you. You are not fit to be the great leader of Hilpini, nor are you fit to be the commander of the army. You are just a pitiful worm who was defeated by the Dionia more than 10 years ago and has always been afraid of them." Segovani exposed his scars, and Leescock was both embarrassed and angry. A wave of anger rushed to his brain, and he suddenly pounced over, pressing down on Segovani's hand with one hand and strangling Segovani's neck with the other. Segovani struggled with all his might, but he could not break free. His expression changed, and he shouted hoarsely, "Leescock, what are you trying to do? What do you think I'm trying to do?" Leescock approached him with a sinister expression. "You say I am not fit to be the great leader, but are you? Look at your thin and weak body. Are you worthy of being called a valiant Samanese warrior? No wonder the great leader Cottini and his people had always wanted Quinduk to be the great leader. If not for you secretly messing around and slandering his reputation, how could you have become the great leader? And what did you do after you became the great leader? You tore up the alliance with the Dionia, invaded the Campania alliance many times, and triggered a war with the Dionia. Not only did you suffer a crushing defeat, but you also became a captive. You say I am not fit to be the great leader, but are you? You say I am not suitable to lead troops into battle. If not for me, you bastard would still be imprisoned by the Dionia. Not only are you not grateful, but you even insult your benefactor. Have you thrown away the Samanese tradition of repaying kindness? You say I can't do anything to Gurney, but is it your credit to get rid of Quinduk? That was my suggestion and the cooperation of the great leaders. Otherwise, with your stupid brain, what can you think of to get rid of him? What are you two doing? Contrac, who had rushed over after hearing the news, walked into the room and saw the two people entangled together. He shouted, as the great leader of the tribe, instead of thinking about how to defeat our enemy, "You are in the mood to beat and scold here. Aren't you afraid of being seen as a joke by your people?" Lescock took the opportunity to let go of his hands and took a few steps back. His face was immediately full of apology. He explained loudly, "We had an argument just now because of some things. I was too impulsive. I apologize, Segovani. I hope you can forgive me." Segovani rubbed his neck, which was red from being strangled, and stared coldly at Lescock. "Forgive? Only if you die." After saying this, he turned and walked out. Contrak frowned and said with dissatisfaction, "Segovani, some small disputes should not affect our unity, otherwise—" "Shut up, old man." Segovani rudely interrupted Contrak's lecture. "The three of you can unite yourselves. I'm leaving. I'll leave with my tribal warriors tomorrow morning. I'd like to see how long Benventum can hold out." He strode out of the room. What the hell happened? It was rare for Contrak to be insulted to his face, and his old face turned red. Lescock's expression was also ugly, but he did not answer. Bardani, who had just arrived at the door, heard the conversation of the three and quietly turned to leave. That night, Segovani refused to see anyone and kept his word. Despite the repeated dissuasion of Lescock and Contrak, he led Cottini's 8,000 warriors out of Benventum the next morning. Just as the two great chiefs looked at the empty Cottini camp in the city and complained that Segovani was narrow-minded and ignored the overall situation, bad news came from the city again. Great leader Bardani had gathered more than 4,000 Pentanid warriors and was going to leave the city through the north gate and return to his territory. Lescock was shocked. Cottini's army had already left, and if the Pentanid army left as well, the Samanai coalition would fall apart. There would be less than 7,000 warriors left in the city, and facing more than 20,000 enemies outside the city, they would be at a complete disadvantage. So he hurriedly ran to the north of the city, wanting to dissuade Bardani. Contrak was originally following closely behind, but not long after, he slowed down because he suddenly felt that it might be a good thing for Bardani to lead the army away. As long as he blocked the enemy invasion from the east and defended Pentanid's territory, Caracini, who was north of Pentanid, would naturally be safe. Chapter 874. However, Contrak did not plan to leave with his team. He was determined to follow the ancient tradition of the Samanai tribal alliance and defend Benventum with the Hilpini tribe. It was early summer in the mountains. The soil was still moist, the trees were lush, and the weeds were growing crazily. The summer cicadas had already begun to chirp. The scorching sun shone through the densely packed branches and leaves, casting mottled light on the grassland of the mountain ridge. 3 Abenelum scouts were lying on the ground, swatting away the mosquitoes that had bitten them while closely looking down at the winding mountain path. "Big brother, look!" One of the scouts pointed to the front and shouted in surprise. Between the mountain ridges in the east, many birds flew up, chirping and circling in the air. "Let's go and take a look." The scout called Big Brother also had a happy look on his face. He stood up and stretched his sore thighs, then led the other two and ran along the ridge to the east. Not long after, they were lying on the mountain again and looked down. The mountain path more than 100 meters away was crowded with Samanai warriors. They were lined up in a long line, stretching eastward, although the attire of the warriors of the 4 major tribes was roughly the same, and the flags could not be seen clearly due to the distance. The experienced Abenelum scouts could still tell that it was Cottini's army. Under the sunlight, the long line reflected a lot of light, which meant that the army was well armored. Of the 4 major tribes, only Cottini could do so because they were the wealthiest tribe in the eastern plains of Campania, not to mention that this army was heading towards Caltum. Chief Gurney is right. The Cottini have indeed evacuated from Benventum. We didn't wait for this day in vain. The leading scout could not hide the joy on his face. But we still haven't found where the Narconians are? Of course I can't see clearly from this mountain, but I can roughly guess where they are. The leading spy said confidently, ever since their army entered Beneventum, we have not seen the Naconians fighting outside the city. They were not even sent to patrol the city walls, which shows how cautious the Cautini people are. I think they must be in the middle of the army. There are 3,000 of them, so it will be easy to find them. Go back immediately and tell Leader Gurney that I, Sidoni, have started implementing the plan. And you, hurry to the Dionia camp in Lola and tell their commander that we have contacted the Naconian army. Big brother, be careful. Don't worry, I can easily sneak in by myself. Sidoni's words were not comforting, because the Samanai army did not always march on the mountain path like the Dionysian army. When the mountains on both sides slowed down, the Samanai army would separate some soldiers to march on the mountainside on both sides. This not only shortened the length of the marching column, but also reduced the possibility of being ambushed. However, it made it easy for Sidoni to sneak into the army. After sending the 2 scouts away, he patted the dust off his body, grabbed a few javelins, and dived down the mountain under the cover of the trees. Then, he hid in the weeds. After a brief moment of listening to the conversation of the warriors who were marching in close proximity, he rose decisively and pretended to have just come out of the bathroom, approaching the party on the hill. Since he was wearing the same yellow short-sleeved shirt and Caltini's procession was not as strict as that of the Dionians and was rather scattered, he easily blended into the group. Then, through a conversation with several Naconian soldiers around him, he decided to look for the leader of the army of Avangum, the second largest tribe in Naconia. The reason why he did not look for the Quinduk tribe was because this tribe had been completely split up by Segavani, and its people were also forcibly incorporated into the tribes of Lola and Cecilla. You said you are from Abenelum? Vasink looked at the man who tried to sneak up to him but was stopped by his guards. There was a hint of excitement in his voice. Sidoni also noticed that he was young. Judging from his appearance, he should be just over 20 years old. According to the tradition of the Samanai, it was impossible for a young man to lead an army in battle. However, Segavani imprisoned the leaders of the various tribes in Naconia and let their young children lead the warriors of the tribe. This was for better control. To prevent being seen, we'd better talk as we walk, Segavani suggested in a low voice. Vasink subconsciously looked around and nodded. Sidoni pretended to be Vasink's guard and followed behind him with the other soldiers. Vasink could not wait to ask in a low voice, "What's going on in Naconia? We heard rumors in Beneventum that the people of Dionia hated us for killing the priests of Hades and the merchants of Dionia in their territory. After invading Naconia, they not only killed the wolves of Segavani, but also killed our people. But the Cautini soldiers that we were familiar with secretly told us that your people often shouted outside Beneventum, saying that the people of Dionia have formed an alliance with our people in their territory. There are also some other rumors. Which one is true?" Sidoni did not speak immediately. Instead, he took out something from his pocket and quietly handed it to Vasink. Vasink's eyes widened. He recognized it as a small wooden carving that he liked the most when he was young. Sidoni looked at his expression and knew what was going on. "This is a keepsake that your tribe's elder asked me to bring to you. I also have keepsakes for the other tribe leaders. The truth is that the Dionysian army drove away the people of Cautini who were stationed in Naconia and formed an alliance with the tribal elders to fight against the Samanai coalition army." After Sidoni finished, before Vasink could respond, the guards next to him were already excited. The people of Cautini lured Quinduk to death, imprisoned the tribal leaders, slaughtered the people in their territory, forced them to go out to fight, and always let them charge at the front without caring about their lives. The hearts of these Naconian warriors had long been burning with anger. However, due to the strength of the Samanai coalition army and the safety of their people, They had no choice but to endure the humiliation. Now the opportunity had come. Someone even whispered, "Great!" Their eyes were filled with the flames of revenge as they stared at Vasink. Vasink squeezed the small wooden carving in his hand and whispered, "When we reach Kautini, I will secretly send someone to tell the other Naconian generals." On the day that Segavani led the army to retreat from Beneventum, Xanthoparis, who was in the military camp outside Lola, had already decided to attack the city. It had been 4 days since the siege. Why was he so eager to attack the city? On one hand, it was because he was worried that the Samanai coalition army would return, causing all their previous efforts to go to waste. On the other hand, his siege arrangements were almost complete. When he first arrived at the city of Lola, Xanthoparis had carefully observed the plain town of Kautini. Although it was nearly 7 meters high and was a stone city, the city walls were dilapidated, and the gaps in the stone walls were large. Some places even had grass growing. The trench outside the city was not too wide. Although there were simple antlers outside the trench, there were no traps based on this. Xanthoparis estimated that the Kautini town had never been attacked, so it had not been well maintained and repaired, which gave him the confidence to break the city in a short period of time. In fact, the Kautini invaded Campania last year and suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the reinforcements from Dionia, and the Legio III entered Thesala. This had already made Lola, Cessala, and other Kautini towns closer to Thesala feel the danger. They put strengthening the city's defense on their agenda, but it did not take long for the full-scale war between the Samanai and Dionia to break out. The young and middle-aged people of Lola were transferred, and the repair of the city walls was delayed. Xanthoparis considered that there were not many defenders in Lola. Other than the possible reinforcements from the north, the rest of the city was controlled by Dionia and its allies. So, after a discussion with the leader of the Campanian army, Ialos, and the others, they decided to build a hill to approach the city walls. Building a hill to attack a city was one of the military training programs of the Legion of Dionysia. Xanthoparis and the soldiers were no strangers to it. After deciding to build the hill to the south of Lola, the engineers decided to start the construction 40 meters away from the south of the city. So, Xanthoparis ordered most of the soldiers to cut down trees on the hill. At the same time, after the governor of Annona, Adrianx, received Xanthoparis's request for help, he not only organized thousands of Annona people, but also sent some administrative officials with 3 days' worth of rations through the original trade route, through the territory of Naconia, and to the outskirts of Lola. When the Naconians heard the news, they also sent thousands of their people. Following that, the Campanian alliance also sent tens of thousands of people. In less than 2 days, more than 30,000 people, including 12,000 allied soldiers, gathered in the camp of the Dionia coalition army. Xanthoparis made a plan for the construction of the hill. He first left 2,000 Campanian heavy infantry to guard the camp to prevent the enemy from sneaking out of the city. The rest of the soldiers would go to the forest to cut down trees and make wooden palisades that were 5 to 6 meters high. Then, 200 soldiers would erect the palisades 30 meters away from the south wall of Lola. The palisades were 70 meters long to defend against the enemy's arrows and javelins. At the same time, 300 Dionia heavy infantry would be on standby on both sides and behind the palisades to prevent the enemy from leaving the city. Chapter 875. At the same time, the administrative officials of Annona effectively managed the large team of more than 20,000 old people, teenagers, and even women, dividing them into several groups. Some of them cut down the trees and carried them down the hill, placing them at the place where the barracks engineers had planned to build a mound of earth. Others piled up the wood in a crisscrossed manner, gradually extending upwards towards the city wall. In addition, there was another group of people carrying baskets of excavated soil, filling them into the base made of wood, and compacting them. The defenders of Lola on the southern city wall saw such a big movement made by the enemy. While they were shocked, they also felt a little curious. But soon, they discovered that in front of them, a mound of earth about 50 meters wide was rising and rapidly approaching the top of the city wall. The entire wooden fence was also moving forward. It was not that the defenders of Lola did not launch long-range attacks on the enemy who was building the mound below the city, but the javelins and arrows they threw were either blocked by the wooden fence or by the heavy infantry behind the wooden fence with their shields. Although a few of them were injured and fell to the ground, it did not frighten the allied army. Be it the Campanians or the Naconians, they had all been tormented by the Simonians and hated them to the bone. Moreover, the assistance of the Annona citizens in battle would be recorded by the household registration officials, which would be of great help to the development of their families in the kingdom in the future. Therefore, they devoted themselves to this project with great enthusiasm. The defenders of Lola had no choice but to risk going out of the city to attack the enemy several times, trying to destroy the wooden fence and the mound. However, they were all repelled by the army led by Xanthoparis, who was already prepared. Not only did they fail, but they also caused the small number of defenders to suffer considerable losses. The defenders of Lola could only watch as the mound got closer and higher. Not only was it close to the trench, but its highest height was almost equal to the top of the city wall. Xanthoparis no longer needed the wooden fence. Instead, he directly sent more than 1,000 heavy infantry and light infantry of Dionia to stand on the mound and shoot at the defenders from a distance of more than 10 meters. Although there were many casualties on both sides, the defenders of Lola, who only had 1/10 of the number of soldiers, could not withstand such a consumption. They had to repeatedly send messengers to great leader Segovani for urgent help. Regarding Xanthoparis's decision to attack Lola today, the commander of the Campanian alliance, Iolaus, was a little hesitant. The mound we built is not close to the city wall yet. Isn't it too hasty to attack now? Why don't we wait for another day? Xanthoparis patiently explained to him. Our King Devers once said something to the senior generals of the kingdom of Dionia. He said, when fighting a powerful enemy, do not rashly seek a decisive battle, but carefully look for opportunities. But once you obtain an important victory or the enemy shows an obvious flaw, you must continue to attack quickly, not give the enemy a chance to breathe, and completely disrupt the enemy's entire deployment. Now that the main force of the Samni alliance has been attracted to Beneventum, Lola and Caesarea are only garrisoned by more than 1,000 enemies. They think that they can defend for a long time with this small number of people, but they obviously underestimated the siege ability of Dionia. We should quickly attack Lola before they react, and let the overall situation of the war be more favorable to us. Besides, the situation on the battlefield is ever-changing. So far, we have the blessing of the gods. The weather has been good for the past few days, and it looks like it will be a sunny day today. But if there is a sudden downpour tomorrow, it is very likely that our mound will be washed away, and the hard work of the soldiers and citizens will be wasted. Most importantly, it will delay the opportunity to attack. So, we should seize the opportunity while Hades is still protecting us. Also, according to our usual siege training experience, when the earthen hill is approaching the city wall, it is also the most difficult time. The enemy's defense will only be tighter. In order to speed up the progress and reduce casualties, we must rely on fierce attacks to force them to reduce their attacks on the earthen hill, so that we can finish the siege faster. Xanthoparis's serious explanation convinced the generals of the Campanian alliance, and they unanimously agreed to attack Lola today. The next step was to discuss the attack plan. Xanthoparis had already thought about this. The southern wall of Lola is where the mound is, and it is the focus of the attack. I suggest using a heavy infantry battalion and a light infantry battalion from Dionia, plus 1,000 light infantry and 1,000 heavy infantry from Campania, a total of 4,000 people to attack here. Iolaus nodded and said, I agree with General Xanthoparis. The 2,000 Campanian soldiers will be sent from Naples. Xantiparis continued, I suggest that we use the siege equipment we made in the past few days to attack the western wall of Lola. Since the Dionia soldiers are proficient in using these equipment, a heavy infantry battalion from Dionia will be the main attacker, and 1,000 Campanian soldiers will be added as support. Also, 2,000 soldiers from the eastern and northern walls should be arranged to attack with ladders, using this to disperse the few enemies in Lola and weaken their defense. Finally, there will be a light infantry battalion from Dionia and 1,000 Campanian soldiers left. I suggest that they be used as the reserve force for the final assault. As soon as Xantiparis finished, Iolo said, I think General Xantiparis's plan is very good. Naples is willing to send 1,000 soldiers to attack the western wall, while another 1,000 Neapolitan soldiers attack the northern wall. The remaining 1,000 Neapolitan soldiers will be used as the reserve force according to General Xantiparis's suggestion. The rest of the soldiers will be filled by the soldiers of your city. Iolo spoke to Xantiparis with respect, but he spoke to the other generals of the Campanian alliance with a somewhat commanding tone. Only then did Xantiparis realize that Naples was the leader of the Campania alliance. As a military general, he did not think too much about it. Instead, he felt that having Iolos in charge of the generals of the Campania alliance saved him a lot of time as well as a lot of word. Once the plan was confirmed, it was implemented immediately. The first to move were the soldiers of the Allied army outside Lola. This was because the people were already prepared. They carried sacks full of soil and prepared to complete the final closing of the hill and the city wall. Of course, this was also the most difficult moment. Although it was called a hill, it was actually a large inclined causeway. According to the design of the Dionia engineers, the slope was only about 20 degrees. It was relatively gentle and extended from 40 meters to the city wall. Because of the wooden support and the compacted soil as flesh and blood, it was not easy for the soldiers to slip and collapse when they stepped on it. More than 200 Dionia heavy infantrymen, each holding a long shield in their left and right hands, climbed up the hill in 2 rows and advanced toward the city wall. The defending soldiers immediately launched long-range attacks, mainly javelins. The double-sided shields of the Dionia soldiers protected themselves tightly, but even so, there were still soldiers who were injured after the javelins penetrated the shields. Behind them, new heavy infantrymen would step forward to fill the gap in the formation at any time. The light infantrymen behind the Dionia heavy infantrymen also attacked the top of the city wall. Not only did they throw javelins, but they also shot arrows. After all, the defenders at the top of the city wall did not have thick protection like the heavy infantrymen of Dionia. Although some of them were also wearing armor, at least half of them were light infantrymen, and arrows could cause damage to them. When the heavy infantrymen reached the top of the hill, they squatted down and raised their double-sided shields, forming a closely arranged shield wall. The height of the shield wall was almost the same as the opposite wall, and the distance between the two sides was less than 10 meters. Naturally, the attacks from the defenders at the top of the city wall were more fierce. The light infantrymen of Dionia fought back equally fiercely because they had to suppress the attacks from the top of the city wall and protect the safety of their comrade. Within a distance of 10 meters, javelins and arrows constantly crisscrossed and collided in the air from time to time. Screams of pain could be heard from both sides, and some soldiers were injured and fell to the ground. On both sides of the hill, 1,000 Campanian light infantrymen quickly approached the front of the trench while the defenders' attention was attracted by the hill. They attacked the enemies at the top of the city wall to relieve the pressure on their allies on the hill. At this time, the people carrying the soil bags on their backs lined up in a column, bowed their heads, and ran quickly to the top of the hill despite the danger of being hit by the incoming javelins and arrows. At the top of the hill, there was a gap of more than one person between the heavy infantrymen and the light infantrymen of Dionia, thus forming a passage that led directly to the top of the hill. When the people reached the shield wall, The heavy infantrymen on both sides would raise their shields a little higher, leaving a gap at the bottom for the people to push the soil bags down the hill. Then, the empty-handed people would turn back and run down the hill. Countless soil bags continued to roll down the valley formed between the city wall and the hill. Occasionally, the injured soldiers of Dionia and Laura's defenders would fall into the valley, but before they could climb out, they were quickly buried by the soil bags and became a cornerstone of the man-made hill. Not only were the people moving up and down the hill, but the light and heavy infantrymen of Dionia were also constantly taking turns because of their stamina, injuries, and the replenishment of their javelins and arrows. At the bottom of the hill, the medical camp was rapidly giving emergency treatment to the injured people and soldiers. Such a busy but relatively orderly and tense scene was reflected in the eyes of the Neapolitan general, Iolaus, who was at the back. He could not help but sigh. The people of Dionia had turned the tragic siege into an orderly, lively, and efficient construction project. This was not something that any Greek city-state could do. The military power of the kingdom of Dionia was too terrifying. Chapter 876. At the same time, Iolaus also noticed that the attacks of the defenders on the city wall were weakening. Obviously, the Laura warriors who were defending the city wall had never encountered such a siege method. Although they still had the upper hand in the long-range attacks of both sides with the protection of the battlements, the increase in the number of injured also made them feel a lot of pressure. "The enemy is a little messed up," he said to Xanthoparis, who was also observing the enemy from the rear with a joyful expression. "This is a good thing. It can reduce the casualties of the soldiers and civilians, but the hardest battle has yet to come," Xanthoparis said calmly. Iolaus understood what Xanthoparis meant by the hardest battle. It was the face-to-face battle after the hills and walls were closed. Compared to the bustling battlefield in the south of the city, it was much quieter outside the west wall. First, a few hundred Campanian light infantrymen carried the arrowheads made by the carpenters of Dionia and braved the long-range attacks of the defenders on the walls to the trench. They opened the brackets behind the arrowheads and made them stand diagonally to provide cover for the light infantrymen. At the same time, they would shoot javelins and arrows through the gaps between the arrowheads to attack the defenders on the walls. While the defenders were being held back, the Ionian heavy infantry pushed out siege wagons one by one. The engineers of the Legion of Dionysia instructed the carpenters of Ennona and Campania to make these hollow wooden wagons using the wood that the soldiers cut down from the forest. Just like how the soldiers of the Second Legion did when the Devers led the army to attack Rome, the wooden wagons were connected as they were pushed towards the walls, all the way to the trench. Not only were the Allied soldiers surprised, but the defenders on the walls were also dumbfounded. There was no one on the wooden wagons, and the fired arrows could not ignite them. Meanwhile, the soldiers of Dionia quickly passed the sacks filled with soil in the wagons and quickly filled up the narrow trench in front of them. Then, one by one, the wooden carts continued to push forward until they reached the city wall. This created 2 tunnels from the city wall to 40 meters away. The soldiers at the back immediately carried a large log with an iron awl-shaped battering ram. The battering ram was passed around by the soldiers until it reached the bottom of the city wall. 6 soldiers carried it and used all their strength to ram it against the city wall. The hard hammerhead fiercely struck the stone wall that had not been repaired for many years. Stones shattered, mud and soil fell, and the stone wall cracked. The trembling of the city walls caused the guards on top of the city walls to panic. They increased the intensity of their attack. Stones and wood were smashed down, oil was poured, and fire arrows were fired. However, the carriages closest to the city wall were specially made to be exceptionally sturdy. Not only did the craftsmen reinforce the entire frame of the carriages, but they also adopted a herringbone structure on the roof to facilitate unloading. Furthermore, bags of soil soaked in water were tied to the top of the carriages, so they were not easily ignited. Therefore, the soldiers could safely ram against the city wall. When the siege hammers broke through the outer layer of the stone wall, the rammed earth layer was exposed. The soldiers picked up the pickaxes and shovels and began to dig out the stones around the gap. They expanded the hole in the wall and continued to dig out the rammed earth inside. The defense of the west and south city walls alone had already put a lot of pressure on Lola's troops, not to mention that the Allied forces were also attacking from the east and north. In order to defend the city, the Lola people mobilized all the people in the city who could fight, including the women, to defend the city. The South City was the fiercest battlefield. The battle lasted for half an hour. The arms of the Dionia light infantry were so sore that they could not lift them up. Their fingers were bleeding from pulling the bows. The heavy infantry that formed the shield wall had more than 300 casualties. The casualties among the civilians were not small either. However, a turning point finally appeared. The Lola guards had run out of javelins. In just half an hour they had thrown thousands of javelins. In addition to the javelins that were thrown a few days ago to stop the Dionia people from building the earthen hill, all the javelins in the city had been used up, and the arrows were almost used up. As for the javelins thrown by the Dionia light infantry, they had specially made spearheads. The iron rods connected to the spearheads were very thin. After hitting hard objects, the rods would bend and could no longer be thrown. However, the iron spearheads at the front of the javelins could be quickly dismantled and replaced with new spearheads on the wooden rods at the back. Then, the javelins could be used again. However, it was obviously impossible for the Lola guards to do so. Therefore, the defenders could only throw stones and wood at their opponent. Since the shield wall of Dionia was 10 meters away from the top of the city wall, the heavy stones could not be thrown over. The ones that could be thrown over were more easily blocked by the long shield. Hence, the threat to the heavy infantry of Dionia was much smaller. Since the shield wall could continue to be stable, the civilians could throw the mud bags more quickly. Seeing that the valley was gradually filled up, the mud bags had risen to the feet of the heavy infantry of Dionia. They began to move forward carefully with their shields in order to make it easier for the civilians to fill up the pit in front of them. At this time, Iolaus at the bottom of the earthen hill was already gathering the 1,000 Campanian heavy infantry to replace the troops at the top of the hill. The bugle sounded, and the light infantry of Dionia quickly retreated to the foot of the hill. According to Xanthoparus's plan, Iolaus led the heavy infantry of Campania into more than a dozen columns and slowly marched up the earthen hill to facilitate the evacuation of the civilians and the heavy infantry of Dionia. The heavy infantry of Campania wore Corinth helmets and held large copper shields. They had a narrow field of vision and clumsy movements. Climbing the hill was a difficult task for them. Fortunately, the slope of the earthen hill was gentle, so it did not affect their march too much. Without the assistance of the light infantry, the heavy infantry of Dionia, who formed a shield formation on the top of the earthen hill, moved closer to the city wall. The attacks became fiercer. Some Lola warriors even climbed over the battlements and jumped onto the earthen hill that had almost been filled up. With spears in their hands, they directly attacked the heavy infantry of Dionia. During this long period of defending the city, the defenders of Lola had seen clearly that these Dionia soldiers did not carry spears at all because they held shields in both hands. So the Lola warriors stepped on the bumpy dirt bags one step at a time. They directly used their bodies to knock down the shields and even knock down the enemies. Then, they stabbed the spears in their hands. The shield wall formed by 2 rows of heavy infantry of Dionia became fragmented. When the civilians fled in panic, the officers of Dionia shouted, "Do not retreat! Throw away the shield and change it for a dagger!" In fact, there was no need for them to shout. The soldiers had already done so. These reserve soldiers from the Lucanian mountains had previously endured the enemy's long-range attacks and watched as hundreds of their comrades were killed or injured. Just now, the sudden direct attack of the enemy had caused dozens of casualties. They were all Lucanians who grew up after the establishment of the Kingdom of Dionia. Although the cultural integration of the kingdom had weakened their wildness, Military training had taught them teamwork and comradeship. With the anger of avenging their comrades, they held daggers and shields and fought fiercely with the defenders of Lola. However, the bugle that represented retreat of Dionia was blown at this time. Although the soldiers were unwilling, they had to obey the order. The Lola warriors did not continue to chase after them because they saw the tin cans coming up, so they ran back and jumped over the city wall. On this earthen hill that was more than 50 meters wide, the Campanian heavy infantry slowly approached the defenders at the top of the city wall. They gradually formed a dense formation and were only one battlement away from the defenders. Although the spears could easily pierce the enemy, they could not use the charge and ram that the heavy infantry were good at. Hence, their power was greatly reduced. The bugle sounded continuously. The Campanian heavy infantry on the earthen hill, under the leadership of Iolaus, began to fight fiercely with the enemy. To be honest, the Campanians rarely had such a good opportunity to fight face-to-face with the Simonians. That was because the Simonians always used javelins to kill and injure the Campanian soldiers before retreating and luring them to chase after them. In the process of retreating, the Simonians would take advantage of the enemy's slow movement and repeatedly attack with javelins until the enemy's formation was completely chaotic. Then, the armored infantry would break through and completely defeat the enemy. This was a tried and tested tactic. The continuous failures had terrified the Campanians, so much so that they did not even dare to go out of the city to fight in the field. Today, they finally had the chance to take revenge. The Campanian soldiers roared loudly and stabbed the enemy with their spears. As the defenders of the city, the Lola defenders certainly could not adopt the guerrilla tactics that worked in the past. They could only face the enemy head-on. They let the armored warriors block the battlement, and the light infantry behind them formed a dense formation in the walkway to fight against the Campanian heavy infantry. In order to be able to fight against the enemy, they also transferred some of the defenders on the west wall because they thought that the battle on the west side was relatively calm. Even if there were not many defenders, they would be able to handle it. However, shortly after some of the defenders on the west wall were transferred away, there was bad news. There were 2 collapses on the west wall. It was all thanks to the Dionia soldiers in the siege wagons. They dug out the stone walls and rammed earth at the bottom of the wall, destroying the foundation of the wall, causing the already unstable wall to collapse due to gravity. The scattered stones even injured a few Dionia soldiers who did not manage to retreat in time. The loud rumble and the rising morning mist not only shocked the Lola defenders, but also the Campanian soldiers. When they saw the unique, slow way of attacking the city by the Dionia soldiers, they could not help but despise them, thinking that it was time-consuming and laborious. Some soldiers even said disdainfully, "They say that the Dionia are brave in battle, but it seems that they are also afraid of death. They only know how to hide in wooden boxes." And now, the tragic fate of the city wall had given them a loud slap in the face. Of course, they did not know that in the various military camps in the kingdom of Dionia, the soldiers would not only build a section of the city wall to train their ability to build a city, they would also train how to break through the wall in the next training session. Therefore, the Dionia soldiers were not digging randomly, but destroying the structure of the city wall with purpose and efficiency. Library of Literature. Chapter 877. Attack. Attack now. The officers of Campania hurried the soldiers who were distracted. The Dionia heavy infantry, who had long been prepared, were already shouting excitedly. They covered their heads with their long shields, blocking the stones and wood hurriedly thrown down by the defenders at the top of the city wall, and rushed to one of the gaps in the city wall in a loose formation. The Campanian light infantry in front of the trench also stepped up their attacks on the city wall. After the city wall collapsed downwards, a slope was formed on both sides of the gap. The Dionia soldiers stepped on the rubble and hurriedly jumped onto the gap that could only allow 3 people to pass through. When the defenders of Lola's southern city wall saw that the city wall had collapsed, they immediately sent some soldiers down the city wall to block it. In close combat, the Dionia soldiers with daggers had the advantage, but the Lola warriors were not afraid of casualties in order to protect their homeland. The narrow gap made it difficult for the Dionia soldiers to make progress in a short period of time despite their fierce attack. Woo! Just as the Dionia soldiers and the Campanian soldiers poured into the two gaps in the city wall, the bugle signal for the attack was blown outside the western city wall. The Campanian light infantry in front of the trench immediately put down the arrowheads and laid them on the trench that was only 3 meters wide. The rest of the coalition soldiers carried ladders and rushed up from the rear. Stepping on the wooden bridges made of the arrowheads, they easily bypassed the sparsely placed antlers and put the ladders on the wall. Some of the original western city defenders were sent to reinforce the southern city, and some rushed down the city to block the gap. There were not many soldiers left on the city wall, and they had to help attack the enemy at the gap. They could not deal much damage to the enemy near the city wall, and it was difficult to stop the enemy's ants from attacking the city, so they had to ask for help. But now that the Dionia coalition army in the southern city was attacking fiercely, the armored Lola warriors were not as good as the other party, and they could only barely hold on in a head-on battle. The defense of the eastern and northern city walls mainly relied on the people in the city. It was already a great sacrifice for them to be able to fight until now without being breached by the enemy. Now that the entire city of Lola was under attack from all sides, the whole city was in a tight situation, and there were no extra troops to be sent. The battle lasted until noon. Xantiparis, who was watching the development of the battle outside the southern part of the city, received the good news he had been waiting for. The Allied army had taken over the western part of the city. Xantiparis breathed a sigh of relief and relaxed. Lola City was finally taken, although for him, this was the first time he led an army on his own after joining the Kingdom of Dionia. However, he had achieved such a great result in his first army battle. Perhaps in his lifetime, he might be able to realize his initial wish to become a real legion commander and wash away his previous shame, referring to the case of Laodigian. At that time, he was an inspector in the Ministry of Military Affairs, but he did not do his job well, which led to a lack of supervision and allowed some incompetent officers to be promoted. But at the moment, he was a little unhappy. Since the siege of Lola City until now, the army he led had suffered more than 500 casualties. Although most of them were injured, for a team of only 4,000 people, this ratio was already very high, and he was afraid that he would be criticized later. So, he ordered the messenger, inform all the brigades after entering the city, do not advance too quickly, slow down the attack speed, pay attention to protect yourself, and reduce casualties. Recruits lack experience, so he could only keep reminding. Watching the messenger leave, Xantiparis sighed softly, rubbed his old waist with his hand, and said, "Go get me a chair." The defense of Lola City was like an inflated pig's urine bubble. Once it was broken, it would quickly collapse. However, Xantiparis's worries soon came true. The Lola garrison and people who retreated from the top of the city did not surrender. They still stubbornly blocked the Allied army's advance in the city. This angered the Allied army soldiers who had already paid a lot of casualties during the siege, especially the Campanian soldiers who had been poisoned by the Samoyed army. They not only increased the intensity of the attack, but also regarded men, women, old and young as enemies in the city. The people of Lola were outnumbered, and there was no citadel in the city to carry out the final defense like in the Greek city-states. In the afternoon, almost all the people in Lola were killed in battle, and it was completely occupied by the Allied army. However, the leaders of the Allied army did not rejoice in victory, because an Abenelum spy brought them bad news. Thousands of Cautini warriors left Beneventum early in the morning and were marching west. The Allied army generals led by Xantiparis and Iolos immediately became nervous. They were worried that the Samoyed army was coming to rescue Lola. Fortunately, they no longer needed to worry about the order in Lola City being unstable. After a discussion, the Allied army generals decided to let the soldiers quickly rest and eat rations to restore their strength as soon as possible. The cleaning of the entire battlefield, the removal of the barracks outside the city, the inventory of the materials in the city, were all handed over to the Annona officials, and at the same time, the people of Annona, Campania, and Narconia were in charge. In fact, this was tantamount to handing over the management of Lola City to Dionia. For the Campanians, there was nothing they could do. The Samoyed allied army invaded on a large scale, slaughtered and captured a large number of Campanians, and destroyed towns and villages. Dozens of miles around the city of Naples was almost a wilderness. Now, the population of the Campanian alliance was not enough to fill the wastelands, so there was no way they would covet the land in the eastern plains of Campania. Moreover, this place was close to the mountains, and it was more likely to be attacked by the Samoyed. Therefore, the people of Dionia stationed here could instead become a security barrier for the Campanian alliance. For Dionia, after Legio III defeated the Cautini invasion of the Campanian alliance, they had formulated a punishment plan to occupy Lola, Caesarea, and Capua. Now they were just picking up this plan again. On one hand, Adrianx sent the Annona officials to lead the people here to help the Allied army attack the city, and on the other hand, he had the idea of quickly taking over the city after conquering Lola. The kingdom of Dionia and the Campanian alliance reached a tacit understanding in silence, each taking what they needed. But now, the Samni reinforcements that could arrive at any time were likely to make the victory that they exchanged with the blood of their soldiers go up in smoke. Fortunately, the distance from Beneventum to Lola was more than 90 miles, and half of it was mountain road. So, several generals of the Campanian alliance believed that it was impossible for the Cautini to reach Lola within a day. As the saying goes, what you fear will happen. At dusk, the scouts sent to the north to keep a close eye on the enemy's movements hurried back to report that a Samni army had left the Abella Pass and was heading towards Lola. There were about 10,000 of them. The generals of the Campanian alliance were shocked when they heard the news. They heard from the Abenelum scouts that the enemy only had a few thousand people. How did it become 10,000 in just a few hours? Immediately, one of the generals expressed his doubts. Did you properly check the number of the enemy? I want you to confirm it again. Another general suggested. The Samni are coming fiercely, and our soldiers have just gone through a fierce battle. Not only are they very tired, but they have also suffered some casualties. We urgently need to rest and reorganize. Now that the walls of Lola are broken, we can't hold on. Why don't we lead the army to retreat first and fight again when we are fully prepared? His suggestion received the approval of several generals. Even Iolaus appeared hesitant, unable to make a decision. He could only look at Xanthoparis. Xanthoparis looked around at the generals of the Campanian alliance. He knew that although they had conquered the city of Lola and won a victory against the Samni, the Campanian alliance's repeated failures against the Samni for decades had made them fear the Samni. Once the situation was unfavorable, the first thing they would think of was to retreat. He must give them the courage to fight. Xanthoparis pondered for a moment, then said in a low voice, "Everyone, if we are going to retreat, there are a few problems that you have to consider first. First, what about these tens of thousands of people? They are not soldiers. They are young, strong, and disciplined. There are many old people and women among them. They move slowly and lack organization. Once they retreat, the scene will definitely be chaotic. The Samni army is so fast. Once they catch up, it will be a disaster. Second, the war started by the Samni has caused great losses to the Campanian alliance. We have finally conquered Lola and were about to block the Samni in the mountains, preventing them from invading again. Now we have to give up on Lola. Once we give it up, it will not be so easy to recapture it again. The Samni will definitely learn from this lesson and deploy enough soldiers here. This will lead to a stalemate. The main force of our Dionysian army is fighting in the east, in the mountains. That is the homeland of the Samani. The battle will be difficult, and we will not be able to achieve any results in a short time. There will also be no new reinforcements here, because the kingdom is also fighting a bigger war in Sicily and Latin. Chapter 878. Xanthoparis' sincere words greatly touched the generals of the Campanian alliance. People like Iolaus immediately thought of the predicament of Naples. There were too many refugees in the city, there was a lack of food, and it was difficult to maintain order. What they were most afraid of was the outbreak of a plague. The generals of cities like Herculaneum and Rhytrum were eager to lead their people back to their homes, but their cities were in ruins. If the Simonians attacked again, they would not be able to defend themselves. Would they have to continue hiding in Naples? Not only would the people find it hard to bear, but the militias under them would also oppose it. Seeing that the generals of the Campanian alliance were deep in thought, Xanthoparis said, "Our soldiers are indeed a little tired after a tough battle, but at least they have time to rest. But aren't the Simonians tired after coming from afar? It took them 1 day to get here from Beneventum. I'm afraid they didn't rest much on the way. They must be even more tired than our soldiers. Can they still run like the wind in battle like before? Furthermore, our soldiers have just conquered Lola, and their confidence has been boosted. The Simonians are worried about Lola, so their morale is not as high as ours. Furthermore, even if the Simonians have 10,000 reinforcements, we still outnumber them. Don't forget that there are more than 2,000 warriors from Niconia in their army. The spies from Abenalum have already said that they have secretly contacted the commander of Niconia's army. So, these 2,000 Niconia warriors are not allies of the Simonians' reinforcements. They are here to help us at a critical moment." Xanthoparis' mood became high. "Everyone, we have so many advantages. We should seize this opportunity to take the initiative to attack the enemies, defeat them, and completely drive them out of the Campanian plains. Let the people of the Campanian alliance enjoy peace and tranquility." Xanthoparis' words made most of the generals feel excited, and their doubts were gone. But there were also people who objected. Can the words of the Abenalum be trusted? The Simonians and the Campanians had been fighting for decades. Both sides regarded each other as mortal enemies. How could they be trusted so easily? Before Xanthoparis could answer, Iolaus said, "The Abenalum helped General Alexis defeat Samonet's army in the mountains, and now they are besieging Beneventum. Why can't they be trusted? The Abenalum is an ally of Dionia, so of course they are our friends. The same goes for the Naconians. Don't forget, we were able to conquer Lola City thanks to them." In fact, it was not that the Naconians did not clash with the Campanians in Lola. It was just that the Annona officials tried their best to isolate the Campanians from each other and reduce their contact. For example, the Naconians were responsible for trimming the trunks and digging the soil. They were not allowed to participate in the construction of the hill. At night, the Campanians were allowed to rest in the southern part of Niconia. Of course, another reason for this was to prevent the Lola garrison from seeing the close relationship between the Naconians and Dionia. The general stopped talking. Iolaus looked at Xanthoparis and asked solemnly, "If we do as you said and lead the army to welcome the Simonians' reinforcements, can we win?" Xanthoparis replied solemnly, "As long as we fight with all our strength, we will win." Iolaus's previous concern was that once the Allied forces were defeated, it would be difficult for the slow-moving Campanian heavy infantry to escape the pursuit of the Samni. By then, the situation of the Campanian alliance would become even worse than before. However, he had personally participated in the 2 battles of the Dionysian army on the Campanian plains. He was also impressed by Dionia's powerful military capabilities. Therefore, Xanthoparis' affirmation gave him confidence. He faced the generals of the Campanian alliance and said loudly, "Everyone, with the full help of the Dionia alliance, we will definitely defeat the Simonians. Don't hesitate anymore. Gather the soldiers immediately and fight the enemy. Drive them out of the Campanian plains. This time, no one objected. When the Daionia allied forces lined up outside the city of Lola early in the morning, the defenders of Lola felt that something was wrong. They let a small team sneak out of the city. After paying the price of many casualties, they fled into the mountains from the southeast hilly area and escaped the encirclement. Then, they rushed to Beneventum to ask for help. At noon, they happened to meet Segovani's returning army at the entrance of the mountain road leading from Caudium to Beneventum. When Segovani learned that Lola was in danger, he did not hesitate to give the order to speed up. At the same time, he also sent spies to inform Caesarea. Just like that, Caudium's army left the mountains and entered Caudium's territory. They did not enter the city to rest at all. Instead, they continued to march forward, passing through the relatively wide pass between the mountains and arriving at Abella. Here, they met up with the 1,300 warriors sent by Caesarea, bringing the total force to more than 9,000 people. This was already the largest force that the Caudium tribe could send at present. This army walked out of the pass and entered the Campanian plains. They went around the mountains and turned south, heading straight for Lola. Although the road from Caudium to Lola was flat, a day's march still made the Samanese mountain people, who were good at running and full of energy, feel tired. Many tribal leaders asked Segovani to let the warriors rest for a while. However, Segovani refused. From the descriptions of several Lola messengers, he had already realized the determination of the Daionia Campanian alliance to attack Lola. He had to go and reinforce as soon as possible to prevent this town, which was very important to the Caudium tribe, from being controlled by the Daionia. This meant that the southern part of the Caudium territory would be cut off, which he could not allow. About 10 miles away from Lola, Segovani received a report from a spy sent to Lola. The enemy's army is coming out of Lola and coming towards us. There are many soldiers. Are you sure the enemy came out of Lola? Segovani was in disbelief. Great leader, when we approached Lola, the battle had already ended. We only saw many Campanians carrying corpses outside the city. The enemy did come out of Lola's north gate. They were dressed neatly, and it didn't seem like a battle had just ended. The Caudium spy said with a sorrowful expression. Segovani was shocked. Although he led the army to help, he did not think that the Daionia alliance could take down Lola, which was defended by thousands of Caudium warriors, in just a few days. However, the situation had developed beyond his expectations. He only pondered for a while before viciously saying to the bewildered leaders, "Haven't we always complained? If the Campanians didn't hide in the city like turtles, not daring to fight us, we would have occupied the entire Campanian plains long ago. Now the chance has come. Those cowardly Campanians actually dare to attack us. Do they really think that with the help of the Daionia, they can turn from a bunch of rabbits into vicious wolves? Their numbers are about the same as ours, and they have just finished attacking the city, so they came at the right time. We can completely eliminate them. Not only can we take back Lola, but the entire Campanian plains will no longer be able to stop us. The entire situation of the battlefield will be changed by us, the Caudium people." Segovani's words ignited the leaders' fighting spirit, and they all clamored to fight the enemy to the death. Thus, the leaders carried out the order of all troops stop advancing, rest on the spot, and start getting into formation. Before this, Vasank had been anxious. He originally thought that the Caudium army would rest in Caudium after walking through the mountain road. He did not expect them to go straight to Lola, so he could only quietly send his subordinates to inform the other Naconian leaders that the Naconians had broken away from Segovani's control and formed an alliance with Daionia. Now that he received the news that they were going to fight the Campanians, the entire army had to start getting into formation. Vasank became even more anxious. This was because Segovani had also forcefully ordered the Naconian tribes to immediately disperse to their designated positions in the formation, without any refusal or delay. The designated positions that Segovani was referring to were to place the troops of the Naconia tribes on the left, center, and right front or rear of the entire army formation. This way, they wouldn't be able to communicate with each other during battle and wouldn't be able to cooperate with each other. In fact, the Naconian army was now a hot potato for Segovani. With what he had done in his territory and now that Dionia had occupied Naconia, he thought that Naconia was occupied by Dionia. If the Naconian army knew the truth, they would definitely rebel. In Segovani's opinion, it was best to completely separate them and force them into the armies of other tribes. This would, of course, incite the Naconian army to resist. It was not that Segovani did not try this at first. When the Samnite coalition met in Beneventum, he had made this suggestion to the leaders of several other tribes, wanting to use the advantage of the coalition to suppress the resistance of the Naconian warriors and take the opportunity to separate them. However, this suggestion was opposed by Bardani and Contrac, especially Contrac, who harshly rebuked this idea. He believed that it was Quinduc's fault for colluding with foreign enemies, and he and his tribe had already been punished. The other Naconian warriors had performed so valiantly in battle, the Naconian army was always at the forefront under Segovani's command, that it was enough to make up for their past mistakes. Moreover, it was the Samnite military tradition for the tribal leaders to lead their people into battle. Breaking this tradition would only make other tribes feel fear. Literary Library. Chapter 879. Controni's words were exactly what Segovani was worried about. Then, when he privately discussed with other Catini leaders who were close to him, he also encountered strong opposition, so he could only give up. However, the situation changed so quickly that he did not have time to think of a better way to solve the problem of Naconia's army. He was the one who spread the rumors in Beneventum to achieve the purpose of misleading the public. Although it seemed to be effective, it was only a temporary measure. It was also a temporary measure to disperse the Naconian army in the formation. But if he did not send them out to fight, where would he put the more than 2,000 Naconian warriors? Catini or Abella? This would only make Segovani even more worried. He firmly believed that only under such an arrangement would the Naconian warriors fight bravely and not dare to act recklessly. The truth was indeed like this. The reason why Vaisonk was anxious was that the Naconian army seemed to be a whole, but in fact, there was no leader who could convince everyone and make them listen to orders. Everyone was elected at the last minute, young people who led troops for the first time. No one had much prestige, including Vaisonk. Although they knew that Segovani's order was disadvantageous to them, the Naconian army was at a disadvantage in terms of numbers and surrounded by the warriors of other tribes. No young Naconian commander had the confidence and courage to stand up, wave his arm, and then all the Naconian warriors would obey the order and rebel. Therefore, although the Naconian generals expressed their opposition, in the end, they reluctantly obeyed the order and led their troops away. Once they were separated, it was impossible for them to communicate with each other during the battle, let alone act as one. Vaisonk saw that things were not going well, so he could only curse the cruel and cunning Segovani in his heart and wait for an opportunity. Segovani adopted the traditional battle method of the Samnite against the Greek army. The horizontal row of the army was very long, at least 3 miles long, and the length of the column was not short either. This was because the Samnite army was very loose, and the distance between the warriors was very large, so it was easy for them to pass through each other. At dusk, when the sun had already set above the western sea and dyed the sky and sea golden, the enemy figures appeared in Segovani's field of vision. Their thick armor shone under the setting sun, emitting a flickering but not glaring light. This wall of light did not make Segovani and his soldiers feel fear. Instead, they felt relieved because they had defeated such opponents countless times in the past. It was just that the length of the enemy's formation exceeded Segovani's expectations. It stretched to both sides, making it impossible for Segovani to see either end. This was different from the Campanian army's dense and thick phalanx tactic. Is this the way the Daionia people fight? Segovani muttered to himself. Although he had fought with the Daionia once, it was a chase. The two sides had not officially engaged in a battle. However, he could see that the enemy's soldiers were still arranged densely, which meant that the enemy's formation was definitely thin. Of course, Segovani could guess why the enemy had arranged their formation before arriving at the battlefield. Clearly, the Campanians had learned their lesson from the past. The clumsy Campanian army would always be attacked from a distance by the swift Caiutini soldiers when they were in formation. Segovani hesitated for a moment, but he still decided not to rashly adjust his deployment. He would first probe and observe the situation. The allied Daonians halted their advance when they were less than 400 meters away from the enemy. The army, which was 2 miles long but only had 3 horizontal rows, had become crooked after advancing for a certain distance. It was necessary to straighten the battle line before the battle began. There were more than 6,000 heavy infantry in the middle of this formation, including about 1,500 soldiers from Daonia's reserve corps, and 3,000 light armor and light infantry, including the Daionia Light Infantry Brigade, connected on both sides. On both sides were 500 light armor soldiers from Daionia. In addition, there were more than 200 Campanian cavalry on the outermost left flank. The total force was about 11,400. Daonia's opponent, Caiutini, had a total force of more than 9,000 soldiers. The formation was 3 miles long, and most of them were light infantry. These light infantry were also divided into 2 types: pure javelin throwers and light infantry with long shields. They could throw javelins and fight with spears. They formed the main part of Caiutini's formation. Only the rear of the middle was nearly 1,000 armored infantry led by Segovani himself. Caiutini and the Campanian alliance had been mortal enemies for decades. Today, at the edge of the eastern plains of Campania, both sides had used all their forces and were about to engage in a battle that would determine their respective fates. But just as the Daionia coalition army stopped and began to reorganize their formation, Segovani had already given the order. The light infantry in the middle of Caiutini's formation began to advance. As the middle moved, the left and right flanks moved one after another. The movement of Caiutini's formation was different from the heavy and slow movement of the Greek army. It was very fast. Iolaus was well aware of this. As the commander of the Neapolitan army, he stood at the front of the formation. Xanthoparis had advised him to not personally go to the front line, but to command the overall situation from the rear, but he had tactfully refused. Most of the generals elected by the Greek city-states often went to the front line during battles to show that there was no difference in status between them and the soldiers. This was to avoid being criticized by the citizens after the battle. Naples was no exception, especially at such an important moment. At this moment, he did not hesitate to take off his Corinth helmet and throw it on the ground. The other Campanian heavy infantry followed Iolaus's example and took off their Corinth helmets according to the plan. Everyone felt their vision widen and their bodies become much more relaxed. Only the Daionia heavy infantry did not take off their helmets because they were wearing open helmet. Iolaus looked around, raised the spear in his hand, and shouted, "Apollo bless us! We must pursue them courageously and never stop." The surrounding soldiers and officers also shouted, "Pursue them courageously and never stop." When Caiutini's army was about 50 meters away, all the soldiers of the Daionia coalition army were shouting, and their fighting spirit was very high. Xanthoparis, who was riding in the rear, heard the thunderous roar and calmed down a lot. "Attack!" he said loudly. "Woo!" The sonorous sound of the bugle made the entire long line of soldiers, whether it was heavy infantry, light armored soldiers, or cavalry, start to march forward. The sudden movement of the Daionia coalition army did not affect the frontmost soldiers of Cautini's army. As usual, they stopped at a suitable distance, threw the javelins in their hands, and then prepared to retreat through the gap. This way, the soldiers at the back would be in the front, and they would continue to throw the javelins. This repeated, so that even if the enemy was advancing, they would always keep a distance from the enemy, and the javelins would continue to be thrown, causing great damage to the enemy's dense phalanx. In the past, the Campanian coalition army had not gone through special training, and neither did they have light infantry that could compete with them, nor did they have special tactics designed for independent light infantry. The temporarily recruited civilian light infantry could not fight against the powerful Cautini javelin gunners, so after 3 or 4 rounds of throwing, the Campanian coalition army had to stop moving forward. Then, the Cautini warriors immediately turned from retreat to attack, throwing wave after wave of javelins. By the time they ran out of javelins, the Campanians had basically fallen into chaos due to the large number of casualties. Then, the armored infantry of Cautini and the lightly armed infantry with spears would make the final charge, and they would usually be routed at the first touch and win the battle. But now, the Cautini soldiers were surprised to see that the heavy infantry on the opposite side had quickened their pace, and they were getting faster and faster. Are they going to charge? Don't they know that it's impossible for us to fight them head-on, and with their cumbersome speed, they can't possibly catch up to us? Although the Cautini warriors were surprised, as the distance closed, they had no choice but to move to the rear. Their first round of javelins, according to their habit, were thrown slightly upwards due to the distance, more than 30 meters. This way, the javelins could fly a longer distance and land in the middle and rear of the enemy's formation. This would cause chaos in the entire formation and cause the front and rear to fall apart, making it easier for the next attack. However, the sudden increase in speed and the thinness of the enemy's formation caused most of the javelins to miss. The heavy infantry of the Allied army, who had dodged the javelins, became even more confident. They raised their shields diagonally to protect their heads, and their footsteps became stronger and faster. This quickly shortened the distance between the two sides to less than 20 meters, and the Cautini soldiers who threw the javelins did not even have time to fully prepare. They hurriedly threw the javelins in their hands. The 500 Naconian soldiers led by Vassan were part of the second wave of attack. They had all received a hint from Vassan beforehand, so most of the soldiers simply threw the javelins into the air and immediately retreated. However, the momentum of the Greek heavy infantry's desperate charge made Vassan's mind spin. Even though the Cautini warriors hurriedly threw the javelins, their rich experience allowed them to throw the javelins in a straight line. Countless heavy javelins were thrown by the powerful arm strength of the warriors, and with the help of the leather ropes, they spun as they flew, stabbing straight at the shields of the heavy infantry. Many of the javelins directly penetrated the shields, causing some of the heavy infantry to be injured. Chapter 880. But this did not stop the Greek heavy infantry from advancing. Instead, they were forced to sprint forward desperately. They all remembered the words their officers had warned them before the battle. You have to charge forward regardless of your physical strength. As long as you catch up with the cowardly Cautini enemies and make them unable to throw their javelins, we will be safe. The third wave of javelins from the Cautini army did not come immediately because the distance was too close. Not to mention that there was no time to throw, they did not even have time to change positions with the warriors who had just thrown their javelins. After the battle began, the Cautini warriors and even the Samnese warriors, under the leadership of their tribal leaders, generally followed the traditional battle routine, but their movements were basically free. They could choose whether to attack or retreat according to the changes in the battlefield. Because their formation was very loose and the spacing was relatively large, the entire army was flexible during the battle. Now all the Cautini warriors, including Segavani, began to turn around and run. They were not afraid of such an attack from the enemy, because they firmly believed that the Greeks could not outrun them. Once they opened up the distance and the Greeks had no physical strength, it would be time for them to attack at will. Compared to the heavy infantry in the middle, the light infantry on the flanks sprinted even faster. The Cautini warriors only threw the first round of javelins, and after causing some damage, they had no choice but to retreat. In fact, in terms of the equipment of both sides, they could completely rush up and fight the other side, but due to the habit of fighting for a long time, using javelins to cause confusion before engaging in close combat, and the fear of being surrounded by the enemy after being entangled, these tribal leaders were not so selfless as to let their own warriors attract the enemy for others. As for the light armored soldiers on both ends of the army, there were no Campanian warriors in front of them. These citizens of Dionia from the Lucanian mountains ran with their strong legs to their heart's content without the enemy's obstruction. In fact, their position was almost at the same level as the frontline Cautini warriors on the inner side, but they did not turn inward to attack. Instead, they continued to move forward. The Campanian cavalry on the outside of the left wing was faster. The running war horse had already brought them to the flank and rear of the Cautini army, but they did not have the courage to directly intercept the hundreds of retreating enemies. Instead, they waved their lances and approached them from the side, trying to force them to go to the middle, thus blocking the enemy's path in other positions and delaying the retreat of the entire army. But after the Cautini warriors threw their javelins and shot down more than a dozen cavalrymen, these Campanian cavalry no longer dared to approach the enemy. What was supposed to be a fierce battle had unexpectedly turned into a grand competition. On the long front line that was more than 3 miles long, be it the Dionian allied army or the Cautini warriors, all of them were running at full speed, causing the ground to rumble and dust to fly everywhere. After running for some time, the panting Dionian heavy infantry heard the officers' panting yell, "Throw! Throw away the shields! Throw away the shields!" They did as they were told without hesitation. Once the heaviest shield was thrown away, they only held the javelins in their hands. Their bodies instantly felt relaxed, and their speed was maintained. The distance between them and the Cautini warriors was not widened. This was the original plan, and the Campanian heavy infantry was influenced by it. Under the leadership of the generals led by Iolaus, they also threw away the shields in their hands. At first, the Campanian heavy infantry were not used to not wearing helmets and shields, but they gradually got used to it after running non-stop. The Cautini warriors thought that the Greeks would stop as usual after a charge, but they did not expect that the enemy would not stop once they started running. Although they saw that the enemy had thrown away their helmets and shields, and logically speaking, this was the best time to attack with javelins, the distance between the two sides was too close. Throwing a javelin required some preparation time, and these few seconds could allow the enemy to reach them. When the entire army was retreating, no tribal leader would take the initiative to ask his people to stop and attack. They would only think, "Faster, faster." If they ran for a while longer, these iron cans would run out of energy. But in fact, the first to feel tired were the Cautini warriors. They were in a hurry to rescue Lola. They had marched all the way without rest or food, and were already very tired when they arrived. Coupled with the sudden nervous running, all the muscles in their bodies began to ache. The reason they still persisted was because of the tenacious nature of the Highlanders. In order to still be able to run, they also began to throw away the shields in their hands. Segavani never thought that the enemy, with the main force of the Campanians, would use such a method to fight, and they were still using the same method to deal with the enemy, which was different from before. When he felt his entire body aching and having difficulty breathing, and the guards around him were also panting like thunder, he suddenly realized that the enemy's strange attack method might have hit their weak spot. However, at this moment, it was impossible for him to stop the entire army and counterattack, because the battle had already begun. The entire army was running, and there was no way for them to pass down orders. The dizziness caused by fatigue and lack of blood to the brain made it impossible for Segavani to think carefully. He simply made up his mind. Let's see who can run first. After a period of running, the entire Dionia coalition army had become a huge crescent formation with the middle at the back and the two wings at the front. The formation was no longer continuous, and there were many gaps, especially in the middle. This worried Xanthoparus's entourage, who was following closely behind the army. General, if we continue to run like this, the gaps in the middle will widen. If the enemy takes the opportunity to attack, it will be troublesome. Should we order the light armor brigade to attack now? Segavani could no longer command the entire Cautini army, nor could Xanthoparus, but he could still command the Dionia army, especially the light armor soldiers at the two ends, because he had been keeping in touch with them through scouts. His men kept an eye on the heavy infantry in front of them, while he, who was riding on his horse, kept an eye on the Cautini warriors in front of him. Their swaying backs and heavy footsteps as they ran made him feel that they were running with difficulty, and most importantly, the distance between them and the soldiers on his side never increased. It was obvious that his use of this tactic was effective. Both sides had exhausted their strength, but for the Cautini warriors, they had lost the speed that gave the Campanian soldiers the most headaches. Therefore, he said confidently, "Don't worry, let them continue to chase." Xanthoparus was not afraid that the Cautini warriors would stop and attack, because close combat was exactly what the allied army hoped for. Even if they tore apart the allied army's formation, he still believed that the final victory belonged to the allied army, because his greatest confidence came from the 4,000 Lucanian reserve soldiers. They were all young citizens with strong bodies and had undergone rigorous training, and they were familiar with the Dionia army system. Their fighting spirit would not be shaken by the chaos of their allies, and instead, they could rely on their tight organization to gain an advantage in a chaotic battle. Moreover, Xanthoparus had another hope, a hope that could completely change the course of the battle. Xanthoparus's eyes searched through the densely packed Cautini warriors in front of him. Everywhere was red. Which ones were the Naconian warriors? At this time, 500 warriors of the Evangam, the second largest tribe in Naconia, were in the middle left of the Cautini army's formation. Vaisonk did not stay idle when he retreated. On one hand, he sent his men to gather the warriors to prevent them from running away, and on the other hand, he sent his men to deliver his signal. The continuous pursuit of the Dionia coalition army showed Vaisonk the Greeks' determination to fight, which was rarely seen in the past battles against the Campanians. He was worried that if the Cautini army really lost the Dionia coalition army, they would lose the great opportunity to escape from Segavani's control. Since he could no longer contact the other Naconian tribes, he might as well go it alone. Vaisonk decided not to wait any longer. He took a deep breath, raised the spear in his hand in the air, and shouted angrily, "Naconians, revenge!" The guards around him, who were already prepared, immediately followed and shouted, "Naconians, revenge!" The other Naconian warriors followed suit. They shouted as they stabbed their spears at the warriors of the Cautini tribe nearby. Before the battle, the leaders of the neighboring tribes had secretly accepted Segavani's order to monitor and guard the Naconian tribe. However, after the battle started, the warriors were focused on retreating. Since the Dionia coalition army was in a hurry to catch up, they did not have the energy to care about anything else. At the same time, they gradually lost their guard against the Naconian warriors. Unexpectedly, there was a sudden change. The Evangam warriors attacked in all directions and stabbed many of the Cautini warriors. The other Cautini warriors were shocked, but their first reaction was not to fight back. Instead, they wanted to avoid these crazy Naconian warriors and continue to retreat. They did not forget that there were still enemies behind them. However, they all dodged to the outside, which naturally blocked the retreat route of the warriors behind them, causing the suddenly chaotic area to spread out. The Kautini warriors behind them were only blocked for 10 seconds before the Allied army soldiers, who were chasing them, caught up and stabbed them with their spears.